Archaeological discoveries in Egypt, particularly those of Petrie, have revealed evidence of an ancient people who lived before the historic Egyptians. This early civilization, sometimes referred to as an old race, displayed a more refined art style and left behind achievements that suggest a culture older and more advanced than that of later dynasties. Ancient traditions remembered them as the Kushite Ethiopians, a people credited with founding some of the earliest centers of civilization, pioneering arts, sciences, and the building of cities. From their influence came the wealth of India, the luxury goods of Babylon, and the remarkable prehistoric cultures of Asia Minor. Their greatness, according to ancient testimony, rested not on conquest alone, but on cooperation and a democratic spirit. They were said to have built colossal walls, vast lakes, and roads so enduring that traces remain to this day. Yet much of modern history writing has either neglected or dismissed this legacy. While archaeologists uncover traces and ethnologists suggest origins, many conventional historians cling to outdated theories. When Egypt first appeared in the written record, it was already old, its culture the product of millennia. No society, the ancients insisted, simply emerged fully formed into the world of science and art. Behind Egypt stood teachers, and many ancient authorities pointed to the Kushite Empire, believed to have ruled across 3 continents for untold centuries. Compared with their immense achievements, the celebrated campaigns of Alexander, Caesar, or Napoleon appear small in scale. From the Mediterranean shores to distant lands, ruins of vast cities, massive constructions, and enduring works are attributed to this forgotten power. Ethiopia, in antiquity, was not confined to a small African kingdom. Old maps and classical geography describe a far wider dominion, stretching through much of the Torrid Zone, from India across Asia to parts of Europe. Some scholars have noted similarities between this Kushite stock and the Dravidian peoples of India. Languages once spoken across Crete, Lydia, the Caucasus, Sumer, and Elam are thought by some to have been branches of this Hamitic family. Ancient writers even claimed that Ethiopia was the first established nation where laws were created and the worship of the gods first practiced. The principles upon which later republican governments rested, justice, equality, intelligence, and industry, were said to be the foundation stones of this dominion. Despite the evidence preserved in monuments and the records of Egypt, Chaldea, Greece, and the Hebrews, modern historians often ignore these testimonies. Yet ancient sources consistently describe a time when Ethiopians traded across the Mediterranean, filled its islands and coasts with thriving cities, and influenced the religious pantheons of later Greeks and Romans. Their kings and queens became the gods and goddesses of later mythology, worshipped across the ancient world. 19th century scholars, such as Rawlinson, concluded that while later ages owed much to Semitic and Indo-European peoples, the earliest advances in writing, astronomy, history, architecture, navigation, agriculture, and industry came from Egypt and Babylon, both cultures rooted in the descendants of Ham. These early pioneers domesticated animals and transformed wild plants into crops such as wheat and rye, laying the very foundations of agriculture. Their contributions were so ancient that the original forms of these plants have vanished. The truth is that much of what sustains modern life, food, farming, science, and art, was first given by these prehistoric innovators whose legacy remains hidden beneath the surface of history. Early scholars, such as Rawlinson, emphasized that the first inventors of the arts and sciences were among humanity's greatest benefactors, taking bold steps from ignorance into discovery. Bunsen likewise argued that the Hamitic peoples, identified with the ancient Ethiopians, Egyptians, Canaanites, and Chaldeans, formed the true foundation of civilization. Inscriptions, biblical testimony, and early records all trace their kinship, linking Kush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan as sons of Ham. From these branches arose Egypt, Canaan, Africa, and the wide-reaching Kushite colonies that extended across Asia and Africa, leaving behind monumental achievements. Their influence stretched into Arabia, Persia, Media, and even regions between the Indus and the Tigris. In Africa, they were the builders of the Nile Valley's great monuments, the architects of southern Arabia's stone edifices, and the creators of works that left enduring traces in distant lands from Siberia to the Americas. This Kushite empire, vast and powerful, has often been overlooked in modern accounts, yet its cultural and technological impact was immense. Scholars have noted that their language, now lost, once spanned wide territories and linked diverse peoples, from the Dravidians of India to early Mediterranean cultures. Ancient testimonies consistently describe the Ethiopians as the first to establish laws, to worship the gods, and to organize communities around principles of equality, industry, intelligence, and justice. Such foundations shaped the later institutions of republics and civilizations that followed. Other researchers, including Wells, Baldwin, and Wilford, acknowledged that early traditions and inscriptions confirmed the antiquity and scope of this culture. Sanskrit writings of India describe Ethiopia as a vast division of the world, encompassing Arabia, Asia Minor, Syria, Nubia, Armenia, and Mesopotamia, portraying it as a region of wealth, power, and enlightenment. The Phoenicians themselves once called their people Ethiopians, and even Samaritans were described as Kushites in ancient records. These sources suggest that many nations now categorized under other racial labels were originally part of this expansive Kushite identity. Chronological accounts trace their influence far back, perhaps to 7,000 or 8,000 BC, when Kushite colonies were already established in Egypt and Chaldea. By 5000 BC, Egypt and Chaldea emerged as separate entities, but both still reflected the unrivaled achievements of their Kushite roots. Later divisions and declines followed, yet remnants of their civilization persisted in Arabia, Phoenicia, and Ethiopia well into historical times. Their cultural dominance waned before the rise of Assyria, but their legacy of monumental architecture, scientific progress, and global trade continued to shape the ancient world. Even the enchanting tales of the Arabian Nights carry echoes of this forgotten empire. Though clothed in fantasy with genii and fairies, their settings in India, Persia, Arabia, and Chaldea reflect the once widespread Kushite civilization during its fading glory. Archaeology continues to uncover artifacts and ruins across these regions that testify to this early power, relics as dazzling in their own way as the legendary treasures of Aladdin's lamp. Far from being mythical, these discoveries confirm that an advanced and far-reaching civilization once spanned continents, leaving its mark on the dawn of history. Herein observed that from the earliest records to more recent times, the Ethiopians were both celebrated and shrouded in mystery. In the oldest traditions of the ancient world, their name appears constantly. Egyptian priests recorded their deeds in sacred annals, while nations along the Euphrates and Tigris interwove stories of Ethiopian figures into their own legends of conquests and heroic struggles. Even in the distant past, traces of them can be seen within Greek mythology. Figures such as Dionysus, Hercules, Saturn, Osiris, Zeus, and Apollo were remembered as Kushite rulers of prehistoric ages. Around these great leaders and deities, the peoples of the Mediterranean and the East created the mythologies that later generations inherited. Although ignorance and prejudice sometimes dismissed their feats as fantasy, the enduring monuments they left behind stand as undeniable evidence of a civilization that profoundly shaped the art, culture, and memory of the ancient world. The exploits of Kushite heroes were carved into sculpture, celebrated in drama, and painted in vivid forms. They were honored by nearly every people who reached civilization at the dawn of history. Their influence ran deep through the literature and music of Greece and Rome, where Ethiopian themes left an unmistakable mark that still resonates in the foundations of art today. Herein noted that long before the Greeks even knew of Italy or Sicily, Ethiopian fame had already been enshrined in the verses of their poets. They were remembered as the most distant of nations, renowned for justice and cherished by the gods themselves. The divine inhabitants of Olympus were said to journey to their lands and partake in their feasts, as their sacrifices were considered the most pleasing to heaven. And when myth gave way to history, the reputation of the Ethiopians did not fade. They remained objects of fascination and respect, often portrayed by discerning historians as ranking among the foremost in wisdom, knowledge, and civilization. Because of the immense span of time, identifying the original seat of the early Ethiopian Empire is challenging. Some, like Bokart, believed it was located in Happy Arabia, from which the Kushite race spread both eastward and westward. Others, such as Gesenius, thought Africa itself was the cradle. The Greeks, however, looked to ancient Ethiopia, calling the Upper Nile the birthplace of humankind and associating it with the fabled Garden of Eden. From this region came the earliest traditions, rituals, colonies, and arts of antiquity. The Greeks also asserted that Egyptian civilization and religion were derived from Ethiopia, noting that Egypt's religious practices were not original, and even by 3,000 years ago, much of their deeper meaning had been lost among the priesthood. Yet, these same forms of worship continued to survive among the Ethiopians of Nubia, suggesting Egypt's religion was an inheritance from its southern neighbor. Writers of the Ptolemaic age claimed Egypt was literally built from Ethiopian soil carried down by the Nile, and that Ethiopians were the first people to live, the only truly native race, and the first to establish worship and sacrifice. Egypt itself was regarded as a colony of Ethiopia, and their laws and writing systems were originally the same. In Ethiopia, knowledge of script was widely known among the people, whereas in Egypt it was confined mostly to the priestly class. The city of Meroë stood as a great center, with impressive red brick structures, and by 800 BC at Napata, stone buildings already marked the landscape. Ancient traditions confirm that Meroë was the birthplace of the worship of Zeus, Ammon, and Osiris, and that commerce, science, and art traveled northward from the Upper Nile into Egypt. Herodotus even described the Ethiopians as wise men who lived long lives, retaining the customs of the Golden Age, and whom the gods themselves honored with their presence. Greek portrayals of Ethiopia were often idealized, while Indian Sanskrit texts also spoke of Ethiopia as possessing a civilization older than Egypt. These writings mention Kushite kings, who were later absorbed into the mythologies of Greece and Rome. The Hindu Puranas recorded that Kushites reached India before Egypt, linking Hindu civilization with that of Chaldea and the Nile. They described Egypt as a colony drawn from Kusha Dwipa, and the Phoenicians as another Kushite offshoot. In early ages, the Ethiopian seat of power wasn't Meroë as we know it, but an older kingdom called Meru. Sanskrit traditions described Meru as the abode of the gods, with Indra, chief deity of the Hindus, deified as its king. Colonists from Ethiopia thus played a role in shaping early India, and writers noted little difference in appearance between the two peoples. Legends spoke of rulers like Deva Nahusha of Meru, said to have extended his empire over 3 worlds. Ancient poetry from Asia Minor, such as the Old Phrygia, told of Dionysus, remembered as an Ethiopian king predating Menes by many ages. Later, Greek interpretations reshaped his story into that of the god of wine, twisting Kushite mythology to suit their own traditions. Even the Trojan War had versions called the Ethiops, reflecting the belief that many of Troy's valiant defenders were Kushite Ethiopians. In those times, Egypt often fell under Ethiopian dominance. Ancient writings frequently paired the two nations, emphasizing Ethiopia's political and royal influence over Egypt. Sometimes Ethiopia ruled Egypt, sometimes it was weakened by wars with it, but the close relationship was undeniable. Older sources were filled with stories of these remarkable Ethiopians, while modern accounts tend to overlook them. Yet the people of the Blue Nile highlands still preserve a sense of their proud past, calling themselves Ethiopians and remembering their land as a source of light and inspiration that shaped the destinies of younger civilizations. Herein remarked that apart from the Egyptians, no native African people commands such attention as the Ethiopians. He questioned how their renown, despite being one of the most distant nations, spread across deserts that even today form barriers to approach. Many peoples across Africa and parts of Asia were once called Ethiopians, distinguished by their dark or black skin. Monuments confirm the deep antiquity of Meroë, and during the Persian period, Ethiopia was a strong and independent state, resisting conquest even by Cambyses. Rossellini believed that Ethiopian kings such as Sabako and Tirhaka ruled Egypt not merely by force, but by legitimate descent, a view supported by the respect shown to their monuments by later rulers. Egyptian reliefs show Ethiopians as the builders and master craftsmen of the earliest times. The first courses of the pyramids were made of Ethiopian stone. The Kushites were a priestly race whose religion carried astronomical meaning, reflected in the design and orientation of the pyramids. In Upper Egypt, depictions show black priests passing religious symbols to lighter-skinned Egyptians, evidence that the roots of Egyptian worship lay in Ethiopia. This priesthood once held great influence along the Nile, and when it withdrew to Napata, Egypt's religion began to lose its true meaning, deteriorating steadily in both faith and language. Even today, in Nubia, the people display qualities that suggest superiority over the Egyptians. Travelers have described them as strong, warlike, and industrious, with moral qualities that stand out. Their physical features, dark skin, woolly hair, narrow elongated skulls, mark them as direct descendants of the ancient Ethiopian race. Archaeological findings support this, with skulls from Egypt's Old Kingdom showing distinct Negroid traits. The Great Sphinx and the statues of early pharaohs reveal the Ethiopian origin of Egypt's first rulers. Inscriptions also show that these peoples lived along Egypt's borders from the earliest times. Egyptians themselves said their religion came from the land of Punt, often identified with Somaliland south of Nubia. Ancient reliefs depict Punt's people and products, ebony, ivory, gold, and incense, brought back to Egypt. Punt was known as a holy land, and expeditions there were recorded as early as 2000 BC. Ruins in East Africa further confirm its significance. Incense from Punt became central to religious rituals across the ancient world. Throughout history, Ethiopians were the backbone of Egypt's armies. The Egyptian people, by nature, were not warlike, while the Kushites supplied the leadership, strength, and courage that carried Egyptian arms abroad. They were allies and commanders, not slaves. Their power extended far beyond the Nile, leaving inscriptions and stone monuments across Arabia and Asia as testimony to their reach. Even now, Nubians retain a strong sense of pride and distinction. They often refuse intermarriage with Egyptians, preserving traditions and a consciousness of their ancient superiority. The Egyptians, much changed from those whom Herodotus described as black, are content to live in simple huts along the Nile, while Nubians maintain ambition, striving to own land and homes in Ethiopia. The contrast reflects the enduring awareness among Nubians of their descent from a once great race whose power and influence shaped the earliest civilizations. Pritchard distinguished two main branches of the Nubians, those living along the Nile and those near the Red Sea. In the time of Herodotus, the regions of Nubia and Sennar were inhabited by two very different peoples. One group, the true Ethiopians, were settled communities with agricultural traditions, while the other was a nomadic, pastoral race of Semitic origin who wandered across the deserts. This division remains visible even today. The tribes of the Red Sea are fierce, inhospitable, and maintain a harsh nomadic life. By contrast, the Nile Nubians, also called Barabra, represent the original Ethiopians. They cultivated the land, planted date groves, and developed irrigation by means of water wheels. These were the same Ethiopians remembered in ancient chronicles as warriors who drove chariots, often allied with the Libyans. At that stage of history, Semitic peoples had not yet mastered the use of iron chariots, which marked a clear distinction between them and the Kushites. Heron noted that the ancestors of the Ethiopians had long been city dwellers who constructed imposing temples, developed systems of law and governance, and spread their reputation for knowledge and the arts far beyond their own lands. Maurice, a careful observer of antiquities, described the ancient Ethiopians as the master builders of the ancient world. When Kushite genius reached its peak, their ambition and skill were directed toward erecting colossal monuments, cutting vast underground chambers into solid rock, creating immense artificial lakes, and spanning valleys with aqueducts and bridges of astonishing scale. They were credited with building the legendary Tower of Babel and the pyramids of Egypt. They carved the grottos along the Nile and the famed caves of Salsette and Elephanta in India, which remain marvels of Hindu architecture. Their mechanical abilities were so advanced that modern generations can scarcely imagine how they managed to raise massive stones, 30, 40, or even 60 feet long and many feet deep, to such great heights in the temples of Baalbek and Thebes. The towering pagodas of India, both in size and grandeur, reflect the same bold vision. These feats of engineering and architecture reveal a race whose works continue to astonish the world and remind us of a civilization that once reached remarkable heights of ingenuity and power. In ancient times, the Nubian-Egyptian desert was a fertile, well-watered and forested land, very different from the barren landscape seen today. Geological evidence suggests that in remote ages its climate resembled that of the Congo Basin, long before the Nile Delta even formed. Over time, climatic changes transformed the Sahara into a vast desert and left Upper Egypt dry and scorching. Keane noted that its intense heat was often fatal to all but full-blooded natives, with even mixed children rarely surviving past childhood under such conditions. Yet in antiquity, this same region supported a flourishing civilization, producing men whom ancient writers regarded as the finest of their age. The area between the Nile, Abyssinia, and northward to Lower Egypt was once known as Ethiopia, also called Beled Sudan, the land of the blacks. Ancient Meroë, located in Upper Nubia, was divided into rich agricultural and pastoral lands. Crowfoot observed that its prosperity rested on an economic foundation equal to that of Egypt or Mesopotamia, with vast fields of grain, wide pastures, and abundant rainfall. Precious stones were plentiful, painted pottery exquisite, and its princes were adorned in splendor. This love for grandeur, ceremony, and fine clothing among Ethiopians was not mere imitation, but a legacy inherited from their ancestors' wealth and culture. Herodotus described Meroë as a great metropolis, with temples dedicated to Zeus Ammon, built in magnificent style. Ethiopia owed much of its wealth to trade. It stood as the central hub of commerce, linking India and Arabia with the interior of Africa and Egypt. Thebes and Meroë shared close ties, even founding colonies in Libya. Meroë lay at the crossroads of great caravan routes that stretched westward across the Sudan and eastward toward Arabia, carrying goods that fueled the prosperity of the Kushites. Spices, incense, cotton, gold, ivory, and ebony, so prized in Egypt, Greece, and Phoenicia, all passed through Ethiopian trade networks. Biblical texts frequently refer to the merchandise of Ethiopia, highlighting its role in ancient international commerce. Cities such as Adule, Aksum, Meroë, Thebes, and Carthage formed a chain of bustling trade centers that linked the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean. Heron emphasized that the exchange between India, Arabia, Ethiopia, Libya, and Egypt was not just commercial, but cultural, seeding the rise of civilizations in each region. The fame of Ethiopia had already reached Greece by the time of Homer, shaping myths and legends such as the Argonaut's voyage, the Garden of the Hesperides, and the oracle at Dodona. The priests of Ammon themselves claimed that many Greek sanctuaries, including Dodona, traced their origins to Thebes and Meroë. Meroë remained a powerful state into the first millennium BC, its fertile soil and wealth giving rise to temples, pyramids, and colossal sculptures. Even its ruins reveal the grandeur of this once great kingdom. Ethiopia also supplied Egypt with gold well into the Middle Ages, its mines yielding riches that adorned countless monuments and tombs. The Fayum district likewise displayed the marvels of ancient engineering. An early pharaoh diverted water to create Lake Moeris, transforming desert into fertile land. This immense project, sustained since the 12th dynasty, was a triumph of human ingenuity. Ethiopia was also rich in minerals, from gold in the Elba Hills to ancient emerald and topaz mines, perhaps the oldest in the world. Its quarries provided sandstone, limestone, and granite for construction across the ages. Barth noted that Nubia contained more monuments and temples than Egypt itself, though many remain buried under desert sands. Among them are the ruins at Masorat, where a vast structure of fluted columns still stands, and the temples of Jebel Arden, with their sphinx-lined avenues. The pyramids of Meroë, though smaller than those of Giza, are more refined in design. Abu Simbel, with its colossal statues and intricate carvings, testifies to the artistic genius of the region. Though centuries of neglect, looting, and destruction have erased much of this heritage, the remnants of pyramids, temples, and monumental ruins across Nubia and Ethiopia still proclaim the grandeur of a civilization that rivaled and in many ways shaped that of Egypt itself. The southern temple at Abu Simbel was carved directly into the living rock, its entrance guarded by 4 colossal statues, each over 60 feet high, their serene and noble faces still marked by inscriptions. Inside are 3 vast halls and a dozen smaller chambers, their walls covered with strikingly vivid paintings. The features of these colossal figures, when examined in authentic depictions, clearly reveal Ethiopian traits. Along the Nile, up to the First Cataract, one finds many other temples and monuments, burial grottos, gateways, towers, and even the remains of Mbendi, an ancient town nearly buried in sand with tunnel-like galleries beneath its houses. The great gateways of Dhaka, the sepulchral cave of Beit el-Wali with its vivid battle and court scenes, and the temples of Dabad and Dhaka, built by the Ethiopian king Ergamenes, all testify to Kushite craftsmanship. Scholars note that while some monuments of Ramses II impress by size, they lack the refinement and artistry found in Nubian works such as Abu Simbel, which stands as one of the world's wonders, a monument of both grandeur and precision. At the height of its power, Meroë maintained an army of 250,000 trained soldiers and 400,000 artisans. The city itself was vast, covering an extraordinary area whose ruins had already vanished by Roman times, leaving only faint traces of its former magnificence. Pyramids stood at Meroë, used as royal tombs, their reliefs depicting rulers with clearly Kushite features. Some scholars believed sites like Maserat may have been great centers of learning or religious oracles from which Ethiopian colonies spread arts, religion, and governance into Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The Encyclopedia Britannica once noted that Nubians bear closer resemblance to the ancient Egyptians than the Copts, long considered their descendants. Dr. Pritchard suggested that the Barabra people may have been descended from the original population that peopled both Egypt and Nubia. This old race of the Upper Nile, often called the Agu or Anu in ancient traditions, spread its culture far and wide, from Egypt to the Aegean, Sicily, Italy, and Spain. Archaeological work in the late 19th century uncovered thousands of tombs showing burial customs associated with ancient Ethiopians, practices that long predated the embalming traditions of Egypt. Despite this wealth of evidence, modern histories often offer only fragmented or contradictory accounts of Ethiopia's past, labeling its people alternatively as Japhetic, Semitic, or Negroid. Ancient records, however, consistently describe them as a powerful and advanced people whose achievements deeply influenced neighboring civilizations. For instance, Cambyses' failed invasion of Ethiopia underscores its strength, while inscriptions and monuments show that by the time of the Persian attack, temples at Napata already lay in ruins, testifying to Ethiopia's far older antiquity. Ethiopia also produced a long line of ruling queens known as the Candaces, one of whose treasurers was converted to Christianity by the Apostle Philip. This tradition of female rulership tied Ethiopia to the biblical Queen of Sheba, remembered for her legendary visit to Solomon. These queens ruled from near Meroë, their wealth built on trade in perfumes, incense, and luxury goods that enriched temples from Memphis to Jerusalem. Incense was especially significant. Carved images in temples from Meroë to Memphis show priests holding censers as they performed rituals. Ethiopia's incense and spices supplied not only Egypt but also Greece, Rome, and later Christian rites. Incense, once necessary to mask the odor of sacrifices, eventually became central to worship itself, a tradition carried forward even into modern religious ceremonies. Ancient writers also described remarkable Ethiopian customs and wealth. The Microbians, a tall and long-lived people, were noted by Herodotus for their unique institutions. Their prisons held captives bound in golden chains, while their mummies, more skillfully preserved than those of Egypt, were encased in transparent crystal. Their Table of the Sun, where food was laid out each night for all to share, symbolized both prosperity and hospitality. Such accounts reveal a people with established laws, advanced techniques in embalming, knowledge of metals, and a flourishing commercial system. Taken together, these traditions, monuments, and historical testimonies present Ethiopia not as a peripheral land, but as one of the great centers of ancient civilization, powerful in arms, rich in trade, refined in art, and enduring in influence. At the dawn of Egypt's historical period, much of the world was still inhabited by primitive peoples. In Europe and northern Asia, Neanderthals sheltered in caves, surviving on raw resources of the wild. Across most of the earth outside Africa, crude stone tools reveal the slow transition of early humans from savagery to a more advanced state. Africa, however, shows no such gradual progression. In the Sudan, for example, there is no evidence of a Stone Age. The African people appear to have moved directly to the use of metals, bypassing the stages that elsewhere marked the rise of civilization. While nomadic Semitic and northern tribes lived in harsher, less fertile regions and clung to shepherding, the fertile Nile and its surrounding lands encouraged agriculture, handicrafts, and eventually the flowering of civilization. Even as late as 3,000 years ago, many of these other peoples remained largely ignorant, borrowing their skills from older Kushite centers. Assyria, often celebrated as an early power, borrowed its science and arts from Kushite Chaldea, and the Hebrews themselves learned farming and building from the Hamitic peoples of Canaan. Some great prehistoric race had already domesticated animals long before written records. When history first opens, livestock are already part of human life. The same people transformed wild plants into staple crops, providing the world with cereals and fruits that remain essential today. Evidence suggests it was the Kushites who accomplished this, for they valued agriculture while nomadic groups despised it. These ancient Africans worked with metals and forged the very tools still recognizable in modern masonry. They gave humanity the hearth, the altar, and the forge, foundations of community, religion, and technology. Ethiopians are credited by antiquity as the first to teach the worship of the gods, to establish sacrifice, and to develop settled life around the hearth. Their smelting of iron was early and sophisticated. Traces of iron are found in the pyramids, testimony to their mastery. The domestic animals central to later cultures, the ox, cow, horse, sheep, and even the elephant and lion, were first tamed by Africans. Kushite mythology reflects this close relationship with animals. They also cultivated wheat, barley, oats, rye, rice, and other staples so long ago that their wild ancestors are lost. Without these gifts, modern civilization would be impossible. Explorers and botanists confirm Africa's remarkable contribution to agriculture, from sorghum and dates to coffee, bananas, and cotton. Ancient Ethiopians were extraordinary farmers, breeding fruits of unusual size and flavor through careful skill rather than accident. Language and writing also appear as gifts of this early culture. Ancient peoples already spoke rich, complex languages when they first appear in history, and the alphabet itself is thought to have been derived from a common source attributed by the Phoenicians to Taut. Equally striking was the religious system of the Kushites. In its earliest form, it was centered on one supreme deity, with rulers who served as priest-kings and were deified after death. Over time, this evolved into ancestor worship, another innovation of the Kushite people, which spread widely across their dominions and survives in many forms even today. Scholars who traced these origins concluded that the Lower Nile was originally settled from Abyssinia and Meroë. Thebes and Edfu were among their earliest cities, ruled at first by priest-kings before power shifted to warrior dynasties around 2000 BC. Yet the influence of the old race extended far beyond Egypt. From the Upper Nile, they spread into Mesopotamia, India, and North Africa, while their colonies reached into the Mediterranean and Western Europe. Their gods became the gods of Egypt, and their culture provided the foundation upon which later empires were built. Travelers and careful observers have long noted the clear resemblance between the Nubians of the Upper Nile and the figures carved into Egyptian monuments. They concluded that this Nubian race was once the ruling force in Egypt, distinct in origin and color from Arabia. According to their own traditions, the Egyptians began as savages, living in reed huts without agriculture or government, until this different and more advanced race settled among them and brought them civilization. These were the ancestors of the Nubians, who went on to plant colonies in Greece, Babylonia, Colchis, and India, lands where priest-kings once ruled and where traces of their ancient influence remain. In ancient Ethiopia, there once flourished a rich body of literature which lasted until the early Christian era. More than 2,000 Ethiopian manuscripts still exist today, though they represent only a fraction of what was once an immense library of writings. Early missionaries regarded it as their duty to destroy pagan works, leaving behind mostly Christian texts. Nubia resisted foreign intrusion with great determination. The Barabra knew well that outsiders would bring violence and oppression, and they fought to preserve their way of life. Mothers sometimes went so far as to drown or disfigure their daughters to prevent their capture, a grim testimony to how highly virtue was valued. By the 6th century, Nubians had embraced Christianity, and for nearly 1,000 years they resisted the spread of Islam with fierce resolve. When Arabs began persecuting Christians in Egypt, it was Nubia that sent a stern warning, powerful enough to make the invaders hesitate. For centuries, the Nubians resisted Arab and Turkish encroachment, preserving a fertile and prosperous land along the Nile. But when foreign domination finally came, ruin followed. Travelers of the 19th century described how the once thriving villages, cultivated fields, and irrigation works had fallen into desolation within a generation of Turkish rule. The contrast between the Nubians' former prosperity and the devastation that followed foreign conquest could not have been more striking. Even after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century transformed the old Egyptian population into a new Arab-speaking people, the Nubian Nile remained a stronghold of independence. For centuries, the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia and Nubia blocked Islamic expansion. Only in the 14th century was this resistance finally broken, after which massacres, slave raids, and forced conversions brought unimaginable destruction. The once flourishing region, famed for its wealth and agriculture, was reduced to poverty and depopulation. Yet traces of ancient greatness remained. Museums in Europe preserve jewelry and artifacts from Meroë, remarkable for their craftsmanship and beauty. These finds, including a bronze vessel decorated with Dionysian masks, reveal a level of skill that rivaled or even surpassed that of the Greeks. Monuments in Nubia further prove the deep entanglement of Ethiopia and Egypt. In many inscriptions, Ethiopian rulers bore the title King of the Two Lands, signifying dominion over both Ethiopia and Egypt. Marriages between Ethiopian princesses and Egyptian pharaohs reinforced this bond. Archaeological excavations have uncovered royal cemeteries at Napata and Nuri, where kings and queens of Ethiopia were buried between the 7th and 3rd centuries BC. The line of Candace queens, long remembered in tradition, held power here. Their jewelry, temples, and pyramids display purely Ethiopian features and styles. These rulers, whose very titles bore the name of Amen-Ra, built monuments that rivaled those of Egypt in elegance. Some scholars regarded the pyramids of Meroë as finer in proportion and artistry than those of Giza, even if smaller in scale. The power of Ethiopian rulers such as Tarkaka and Panki, who conquered Egypt, is recorded in sculpted reliefs. When Egypt became weakened by foreign influences, whole classes of priests and even soldiers abandoned Thebes to join Ethiopia, returning to the land of their ancestors. The priests of Amen, long dominant in Egypt, re-established themselves in Nubia, preserving traditions that Egypt itself had begun to forget. The term Nubia was unknown in ancient times. Everything south of Egypt was simply Ethiopia, the land of dark-skinned peoples. Modern ethnologists recognize the Nile Nubians as essentially of Negro stock, their speech and culture marking them as direct descendants of the old Hamitic race. They are known for their honesty, skill, and industriousness. Their language, sonorous and expressive, remains a living link to their ancient origins. Nubians preserve old traditions in their appearance as well. Their beards, braided in the style seen on Egyptian gods, and even Etruscan sculptures, recall ancient fashions. Amen-Ra himself, one of the greatest gods of Egypt, was depicted as black, and Egyptians took special care to show him as such. Nubian gods were adopted into Egyptian worship, and Egyptian kings often styled themselves as sons of the southern land. The ruins of Nubia, from castles resembling those of medieval Europe to the vast temples of Abu Simbel, testify to a culture of immense power and refinement. These castles, towers, and fortresses, the work of descendants of the Kushite builders, reflect a feudal system that in many ways paralleled that of later Europe. Even today, in Abyssinia, traces of this system remain. The old Ethiopian kingdom, remembered as Seba or Sheba, produced the famous Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon with lavish gifts, a figure remembered by Jewish, Christian, and Arab traditions alike. In the end, Ethiopia was more than Egypt's neighbor. It was its parent and teacher. Its rulers, gods, and culture shaped the life of the Nile Valley, and through Egypt its influence spread to Greece, Rome, and beyond. Though the ruins of Meroë and Napata lie silent today, they preserve the memory of a people whose greatness once rivaled any in the ancient world. The ancient name of Egypt was Kem, meaning the Black Land. This referred not only to the dark soil along the Nile, but also to the color of its people. Egypt was often called the gift of the Nile, for without the river's life-giving floods, the land would have been nothing but desert. Each year, the overflowing waters deposited new layers of rich soil, raising the land through countless centuries. If the Nile failed to flood, famine and drought followed. During the season of high waters, Egypt became an inland sea, with cities standing like islands on natural mounds, An intricate system of canals carried the river's waters throughout the land. In the earliest times, Egypt was inhabited by two distinct groups, or perhaps two divisions of the same race. Ancient testimony agrees that the ruling caste was Ethiopian, who established the powerful priesthood. These priests were not merely religious figures, but also judges, physicians, architects, and astrologers, holding the highest offices in society. Many traditions and records point southward to Meroë and Ethiopia as the source of Egypt's civilization. At first, Egypt was divided under several rulers, but eventually it was united into one kingdom, led by priests and shaped by sacred traditions. Writings from both the East and the Mediterranean affirm that Egyptian civilization was not born on the Delta, but came from the south. Ancient accounts speak of the Nile once flowing through marshes, and that Egypt itself was gradually formed by deposits carried down from Ethiopia. Geology confirms that the sea once reached as far as the base of the pyramids of Memphis, showing how long it took for the Nile to create the land on which Egypt would grow. Some scholars noted that Egypt had no true infancy. Its first settlers were already civilized when they arrived from Ethiopia. The monuments of Egypt hint at great antiquity, older than the memory of its own people. When Abraham entered Egypt, the Sphinx was already a mystery, its meaning long forgotten. The Sphinx and the pyramids were remnants of a religious system belonging to an earlier race. Ancient authors described Egyptian customs and laws as nearly identical to those of Ethiopia, preserving the ways of their ancestors. Later, Egyptians themselves acknowledged that their civilization and religion came from the black peoples of Punt. Archaeological discoveries reveal that prehistoric Egyptians lived in reed huts, dressed in skins, and used stone tools, while those of the Upper Nile were already working with metals and cultivating crops. The merging of local tribes with Kushite colonists gave rise to the historic Egyptian. The elongated skulls of early Egyptians show their Ethiopian roots, though later intermixture altered their features. Even in the great age of Egyptian power, art reflected this ancestry. Sculptures from Thebes, including portraits from the workshop of Thutmose around 1400 BC, depict unmistakably African features. Thebes itself, settled from Meroë, was originally a Nubian city, and Menes, who unified Egypt, was described as a Theban priest of Upper Egypt. Long before his reign, generations of civilization had already passed. The testimony of ancient scholars suggests that ages before Menes, Egyptian civilization had reached a remarkable height. Inscriptions covered temples, writing was widely understood, and education extended even to common workmen. Many believed that the time before Menes was greater than all that followed. By the Fourth Dynasty, over 6,000 years ago, the country had already attained much of the refinement and organization seen in its ruins today. Such achievements could only have been built upon countless centuries of earlier development. Chronologies that compress Egypt's history into a short span are contradicted by both science and tradition. Ancient sources spoke of thousands upon thousands of years of recorded history, preserving laws, institutions, and cultural accomplishments long before the known dynasties. Egyptian priests once told Solon that their sacred records extended back 9,000 years, covering events and achievements of which the Greeks had no memory. These records, preserved in temples, were later lost through war, the destruction of the great library of Alexandria, and the zeal of those who sought to erase pagan traditions. Thus, when history first reveals Egypt, it appears already ancient, with refined language, advanced science, and monumental architecture. These facts suggest that its roots stretched deep into a past far older than conventional reckoning allows, shaped by the Kushite peoples of the Upper Nile, who carried civilization down into the delta and from there spread it to the world. The question often arises as to why the Greeks knew so little of their origins, and why Egypt preserved knowledge of an earlier Hellenic world. This mystery suggests that the historic Greeks were newcomers to the land, settling in regions once occupied by a more ancient race related to the Egyptians. Ethiopia, untouched by the great flood traditions common to most peoples, may have carried forward the arts and sciences of a world that had existed before such catastrophes. Many traditions link the spread of civilization to the Kushite race, whose influence stretched from India to northern Europe, leaving traces far beyond the Nile Valley. Egypt itself was divided into two natural regions: Lower Egypt, extending from the Mediterranean through the Delta, and Upper Egypt, reaching 600 miles southward to the First Cataract. In its earliest days, Upper Egypt was entirely Ethiopian. The oldest monuments reveal rulers with elongated heads, broad noses, full lips, and receding chins, features clearly Kushite. The Great Sphinx, believed to represent one of these ancient kings, bears the unmistakable face of an Ethiopian. Cheops, too, with his commanding features, reflects the same powerful type that shaped the earliest civilization. The fertile delta is described as a vast plain, dotted with mounds beneath which lie the ruins of ancient cities. Villages rise among palm groves, built high enough to escape the Nile's floods. Toward the sea, rainfall and heavy dews enrich the soil. At certain times of year, the entire land becomes a sea of reddish water, from which villages and palm trees emerge. When the waters recede, black mud remains, which soon bursts into green fields and waving grain. In winter, Egypt becomes a lush garden, a stark contrast to the parched and cracked soil of summer. Upper Egypt is a narrow valley hemmed by mountains, with a dry and brilliant climate. Rain is almost unknown, so farming depends on canals dug far below the fields and on devices to lift water for irrigation. The dark, bronzed tones of the delta population contrast with the deeper black of those living under the intense skies of Upper Egypt. Illness and weakness are common in the delta, where exploitation and poor food create misery. But in the south, the people remain healthier, thrifty, and strong. Egyptians are described as simple, cheerful, and hospitable, traits often considered distinctly African. The fella is patient and deeply attached to the Nile, willing to endure hardship rather than rebel. He loves his homeland so much that if removed from it, he soon perishes. Yet he is not inclined to conquest, and military life has never appealed to him. In times of war, men would often hide until the recruiting passed. Ancient Egypt's armies, during its peak of power, were largely led and strengthened by Ethiopians, who carried the true martial spirit. The reluctance of Egyptians to fight explains why the great expansions of old were achieved by the earlier race, not by the peasants of later times. Centuries of foreign domination left their mark. The Egyptians, long oppressed by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Turks, have been robbed of freedom and prosperity. Agriculture decayed, cities fell into decline, and the population was reduced to poverty. Today, most live in simple huts, eating little more than flat cakes of grain. The Copts, concentrated mostly in Upper Egypt, are regarded as the descendants of the Pharaohs. Though darker and with features recalling their ancient heritage, they have long been intermixed with other peoples. Their old language, once the key to the hieroglyphs, has disappeared, replaced by Arabic since the 17th century. Many serve as scribes, artisans, and minor officials, but corruption is common. They form only a fraction of Egypt's people. Modern studies increasingly confirm that culture spread northward into Egypt from Ethiopia and Meroë. Egypt's early rulers were often at war with one another until, around 5500 BC, Menes united the land into one kingdom. The capital at Memphis became the center of the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid building. Yet later dynasties show a decline, with skulls and art styles shifting away from the earlier Ethiopian type. This silent period, when few true achievements were made, suggests the influence of other races replacing the original leadership. It may have been then that Ethiopia turned her energies outward, sending colonies westward into Europe and eastward into Asia. Many nations, stretching from India to Spain, carried the imprint of a common origin, as noted by early scholars. With the decline of the Old Empire, Egypt's religion grew darker, and art lost the vitality and grace that reflected the free spirit of the Ethiopian founders. The more we trace back, the purer the art and the higher the ideals appear, until we reach the shadows of a civilization that left its mark upon the earliest ages of the world. Between 2400 and 2000 BC, the Middle Kingdom emerged in Egypt, marked by the rise of Thebes with its grand temples and the introduction of elaborate religious mysteries. A new deity, Amen-Ra, became the central god of Thebes. Earlier scholars once believed that Amen was not part of Egypt's pantheon until the 11th dynasty, but the discovery of inscriptions in the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties proved otherwise, showing that Amen was already present. The pharaohs claimed direct descent from Amen-Ra, and this was fully accepted by their subjects. Tracing the origins of this god leads back to Ethiopia. Amen-Ra was originally worshipped there, identified with Kush, son of Ham, from whom the Kushite people descended. He was not among Egypt's earliest gods, who dated back to even more ancient ages, but his name entered the cycle of divinities around the time Thebes rose to power, likely due to his legendary conquests. In African tradition, powerful kings were often deified after death, and Amen-Ra became one of the most revered. It is highly probable that descendants of Kush himself sat upon Egypt's throne, which explains why Amen's name and image became prominent in the 11th dynasty and why its kings bore his name. His shrine became Egypt's most important, drawing immense wealth and devotion from the pharaohs. Amen-Ra was acknowledged as Egypt's supreme god, and any attempt to reinterpret him as something else misunderstands the beliefs of the ancients. To them, Zeus, Apollo, and Osiris were not abstract ideas, but real beings. Amen-Ra was seen as the Zeus of the Greeks and the Jupiter of the Romans. He was regarded as ruler over kings because of his dominion, which stretched from India to distant lands in the north. Other figures such as Horus, Apollo, Belus, and Nimrod, his son, were also revered across Kushite colonies. In Egyptian art, African figures are often shown as attendants at festivals held in Amen's honor, a reminder of his origins. Even in the later chapters of Egyptian ritual texts, his name still appears in the language spoken by the people of Punt, linking his worship back to its African roots. Few question the greatness of Egypt, which stood as a beacon of civilization when Europe was still overrun by tribes that left no lasting record. Long before the Greeks rose from their caves, Egypt had mastered astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, architecture, and nearly every art and science that still shapes human life. The grooves of thought and culture we follow today trace back to the banks of the Nile. Early works of art suggest that the Egyptians were a generous and thoughtful people who did not rely on charms, but as time passed and foreign influences mixed with the population, their arts declined. Their religion lost its original meaning, and worship sank to the veneration of animals. Egypt's greatest age was its earliest, for by the time of Ramses II, the decline of art and ideals was already clear. Unlike many rulers of the East, the pharaoh's life was bound by strict religious rules, and the rights of his people were protected by law. In those creative days, Egypt achieved artistic and scientific feats unmatched even today. The embalming of the dead, for example, was likely developed in response to the dampness of the Nile's floods and produced methods of preservation that remain astonishing. The statue of Khafra, carved in diorite, still shows the living presence of its subject, a piece of craftsmanship beyond the ability of modern tools. The transmission of civilization across the ancient world, from Egypt to Chaldea, India, Greece, and Rome, did not add much to the arts already perfected in early Egypt. For thousands of years, humanity perpetuated rather than improved upon these foundations. Even at the time of Columbus, apart from the invention of printing, the arts were not beyond what Egypt had known 6 millennia earlier. This suggests that Egypt had drawn upon an even older source of wisdom. In the Age of Menes, Egyptians had already been architects, sculptors, painters, and theologians for ages. Unlike later kings, Menes's son devoted himself to medicine and wrote texts for the benefit of mankind. The religion of Egypt began in obscurity, centered first on a single supreme being, before splintering into polytheism. Ptah, Lord of Truth and ruler of heaven, was among the earliest great gods. Ra, the sun god, and Osiris, linked with Ethiopia, came after. Osiris and Isis became central to Egyptian belief, with Osiris seen as the judge of the dead, and Isis depicted as a black goddess from the south. Their son Horus was revered as a symbol of renewal. Thoth, the priest-magician and moon god, was tied to knowledge and writing, and was also said to have originated in the regions of the Sudan. Over time, animals were chosen as symbols of deities, and their treatment with reverence, fine clothing, and elaborate funerals expressed devotion to the gods they represented. Osiris, who judged the soul, embodied the hope of life after death, a belief central to Egyptian thought by 3500 BC. Circumcision was widely practiced as a rite of the Ethiopian priestly class, and from them it spread into Egypt. It remained part of the religious life of Africans long after Greek and Roman influence diminished it. Ethiopians and their descendants, such as the Abyssinians and Copts, preserved the custom, linking it directly to the oldest traditions of Africa rather than to later Semitic peoples. Egyptian life, especially in its earlier days, was marked by honesty and skill. Craftsmen excelled in metalwork, weaving, pottery, glassmaking, and jewelry. Their linen was delicate and fine, their imitation gems nearly indistinguishable from the real. The belief that good deeds would be rewarded after death was carved in monuments long before the Hebrew commandments were recorded. Some texts even preserved medical knowledge, including recipes attributed to Osiris himself. Unlike the inscriptions of Crete or Ethiopia, Egyptian writing never evolved into a true alphabet, but remained a complex system of symbols. Their stories, however, often mirrored those later found in Arabian Nights or Aesop's fables. The similarities revealed that these tales were not isolated inventions, but part of a shared cultural inheritance across the vast Kushite Empire, of which Egypt was once a thriving colony. In its earliest form, Egyptian religion and culture were African at their core. shaped and nourished by Ethiopian traditions that gave meaning and depth to the civilization on the Nile. The ordinary houses of Egypt, built from sun-dried brick, already displayed notable craftsmanship. These dwellings were usually square, often rising 2 stories high, with open galleries above and latticed windows for light and air. Their rooms were arranged around courtyards where trees grew, cisterns collected water, and fountains were constructed. Public buildings, in contrast, were of stone. Men worked at the loom and practiced various trades, while women often took charge of marketing and even handled business matters, as was common among African peoples. Warriors held great privileges, controlling 1/3 of the land tax-free, while farmers worked the soil as tenants. Unlike the modern fella, who owns little, these early cultivators were bound to the land under a stable system. The tomb of Amenhotep II at Thebes even shows his wives buried with him, reflecting a custom that echoed Kushite traditions in India. Daily life was richly varied. Ancient tombs depict plows of several designs, along with herds of cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys, and poultry. Butter and cheese were made, while craftsmen such as spinners, weavers, potters, smiths, masons, shoemakers, painters, and glass-blowers are shown at their work as vividly as if they lived yesterday. Scenes of rural life reveal a level of comfort and refinement that rivals modern achievements. Villas had courtyards, galleries, and fountains, and the weaving of linen reached a level of delicacy never since equaled. Furniture, musical instruments, metal vessels, and arms were all made with elegance and skill. Socially, Egyptians were primarily agriculturalists, a hallmark of Hamitic peoples, and looked down upon shepherds. Indeed, to them, swineherds and shepherds were the lowest class. Trade and professions passed from father to son, with records showing one family of architects continuing for more than 20 generations. The domestic tie was strong, with inscriptions and art revealing courtesy, affection, and family devotion. Homes of artisans and farmers were solid and well-built, while the wealthy lived in houses richly adorned with furniture of carved wood, gold, and silver. Entertainment was central to their culture. Jugglers perfected their art, athletic sports and indoor games were popular, and children enjoyed clever toys. Music filled the halls of the elite, with harps, lyres, flutes, trumpets, and drums, providing accompaniment to dances that were graceful rather than wild. Strong religious beliefs, particularly ancestor worship and faith in immortality, led them to perfect embalming, producing mummies that remain intact after thousands of years. The methods they used are still a mystery to us today. Engineering and architecture were perhaps their greatest triumphs. The Nile was redirected to build Memphis, and the artificial Lake Moeris, over 400 miles in circumference, was a marvel of ancient hydraulics. The labyrinth with its 3,000 chambers astonished Herodotus, while the Temple of Karnak, covering vast space, left travelers speechless with its grandeur. The Egyptians clearly possessed knowledge of levers, derricks, and inclined planes to move colossal obelisks and statues. Greek architecture, particularly the Doric style, drew heavily from these models. The pyramids stand as enduring wonders. The Great Pyramid alone contains nearly 90 million cubic feet of masonry, aligned with the cardinal points with mathematical precision. Its stones were cut, polished, and fitted with accuracy that modern builders still cannot easily match. Some evidence suggests advanced drills with jewel tips may have been used. Inscriptions carved into granite remain sharp after 4,000 years, suggesting methods perhaps beyond what is known today. Egyptian sculpture and painting reached heights never surpassed. Works like the wooden figure of Sheikh el-Beled embody a nobility and lifelike presence that astonish even modern viewers. Paintings retain their vivid colors after millennia, and statues capture solemn dignity with unmatched artistry. Their accuracy in fitting massive stones rivals the precision of modern optical instruments, and their mastery of color harmony shows a sophistication equal to any later age. From colossal sphinx-lined avenues to the delicate detail of tomb paintings, Egyptian art and architecture combined vastness with refinement. These creations, still standing after countless centuries, testify not only to the genius of their builders, but to a civilization that saw itself as descended from the gods, and in its achievements came close to seeming so. Scholars such as Monsieur Chabas argued that Egypt must have experienced thousands of years of development before the First Dynasty, for by the Fourth Dynasty, the civilization already displayed a refined and vigorous art. The reign of Menes, beginning around 3900 BC, is often treated as the official starting point of Egyptian history, yet records mention earlier rulers of Upper Egypt long before him. These early ages were remembered as times when semi-divine figures, or even gods themselves, ruled, a tradition paralleled in other ancient cultures that spoke of primeval patriarchs before the Great Flood. Upper Egypt, especially the city of this near Abydos, preserved relics of these earliest rulers, suggesting that Egypt did not begin as an uncultured land, but had been civilized from its origins, drawing heavily from Ethiopia to the south. Menes unified the land and founded Memphis, while his successors dealt with famine, plagues, and new religious practices. The Third Dynasty saw Memphis as the center of power, and monuments already show Egypt's dominance beyond the Nile Valley. The Fourth Dynasty ushered in the Great Pyramid Age under rulers like Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid and the temple near the Sphinx. Far from the accusations of impiety, he was a powerful monarch with an unmistakable Ethiopian profile, embodying immense force of will. Contemporary descriptions emphasize his unmatched presence and authority. Many early pharaohs bore distinct Kushite features, confirming the strong southern roots of Egyptian leadership. By the 5th and 6th dynasties, however, artistic and architectural standards declined, and records eventually grew silent, leaving a blank in the historical record. Around 2400 to 2000 BC, the Middle Kingdom emerged, marked by the rise of Thebes. It was in this period that the 11th and 12th dynasties brought about a revival. Amenemhat I, of southern blood, reunited the two lands, Egypt and Ethiopia, and expanded Egypt's reach. He reclaimed vast tracts of land, drained marshes, and built reservoirs. Agriculture flourished under his reign, producing immense yields of grapes, cotton, grains, and vegetables. Usertesen II presided over the height of prosperity, and under Usertesen III, Egypt experienced both military strength and engineering marvels. This line of rulers, deeply tied to Nubia, restored Egypt's grandeur and ensured its wealth and stability. Yet the kingdom eventually fractured, leaving it vulnerable to the Hyksos invasion. These Asiatic nomads ruled from about 2000 to 1500 BC, destroying temples and halting Egypt's progress. Their presence only highlights the fact that Egyptian civilization did not originate from Asia, for under them Egypt sank into darkness. Liberation came under Ahmes, a Theban of mixed heritage, who secured his rule by marrying Nefertari, an Ethiopian princess of great beauty and influence. She became one of the most venerated queens in Egyptian history, and their son, Amenhotep, reigned with her for many years. Their reign restored Egypt's lost glory, rebuilt temples, and revived commerce. Later pharaohs, even those of Libyan descent, sought legitimacy through marriage to Ethiopian princesses, reinforcing the divine connection to the black god Amen-Ra. By the 18th dynasty, around 1500 BC, Egypt reached the height of its global power. Amenhotep I continued the campaigns into Ethiopia, while Thutmose I expanded Egypt into Phoenicia and Syria. His daughter Hatshepsut declared herself the daughter of Amen and claimed divine incarnation, reflecting the enduring Ethiopian influence at the heart of Egyptian kingship. The greatest of them all, Thutmose III, reigned for over 50 years and became Egypt's most formidable conqueror. He left monuments across the land, created a navy that dominated the Mediterranean, and carved into the walls of Karnak the names of more than 600 conquered cities and nations. From Nubia to Mesopotamia, from Syria to Armenia, his empire stretched across the known world. His reign was the culmination of centuries of Kushite genius, the high point of Egypt's power and civilization. Thutmose III was not only a conqueror, but also a prolific builder. Among his countless works was part of the Great Temple of Karnak, the most magnificent ruin that survives from the ancient world. His reign coincided with the height of Mycenaean culture, and he enriched Egypt with botanical and zoological gardens filled with plants and animals he collected during his campaigns. Tribute poured into Egypt each year from Palestine, Phoenicia, and northern Syria, while Kush and Punt brought offerings, and the kings of Assyria and Chaldea sent homage. This was the imperial age when the Kushite race, ruling from Thebes, revived the traditions of the older Ethiopian world empire that had once stretched across vast lands. In earlier times, its spiritual center had been Meroë, but in later centuries the power base shifted to Napata, marking the decline of an empire said to have lasted thousands of years. His successor, Amenhotep II, captured Nineveh and returned with the bodies of defeated kings as trophies. A new infusion of Nubian blood entered the royal line through Queen Mituma, and her son, Amenhotep III, became one of the most celebrated pharaohs. Remembered by the Greeks as Memnon, the Black Prince who fought at Troy, he left behind monuments of immense grandeur, including the Great Temple at Luxor and the Colossi at Thebes. His reign stretched from southern Ethiopia to Mesopotamia, and he sought prosperity for the Sudan. Statues and portraits of Amenhotep III reveal unmistakable Ethiopian features, a fact that even modern scientists have noted. His son, Tutankhamun, born around 1350 BC, has captured modern imagination since the discovery of his nearly untouched tomb in the Valley of the Kings. When it was opened in 1922, its treasures revealed the wealth and refinement of Egypt's golden age. The furniture, jewelry, alabaster vases, perfumes, and golden ornaments astonished the world. Even though Tutankhamun himself was a relatively weak ruler, his burial goods testified to the power and glory of the 18th dynasty. Wall paintings and statues showed him as black, a reflection of his heritage and his devotion to Amen, the great god of the south. During this period, internal struggles began to surface. Amenhotep IV attempted to impose a new religion, but opposition from the powerful priests of Amen forced him into retreat, and he lost control over Egypt's Asiatic provinces. His successors restored peace with the priesthood and preserved the traditions of the old religion. With the 19th dynasty, Ramses I and Seti I restored Egypt's fading strength, and their descendant Ramses II, ruling for 67 years, became the most famous of all pharaohs. Known to the Greeks as Sesostris, he fathered more than 100 children, raised colossal monuments, and extended Egypt's dominion into Syria, Mesopotamia, Media, Persia, and even as far as India. His reign symbolized the last great outpouring of Kushite energy, as Egypt still drew upon its southern roots. Yet shifts in world populations brought new challenges. Nomadic and warlike groups from Asia and Europe pressed against Egypt's borders, while older Kushite colonies across the Mediterranean world struggled against encroaching tribes. Eventually, Egypt's empire shrank, and after Ramses III, the line of heroic pharaohs gave way to weaker rulers. By 1100 BC, the high priests of Thebes even seized the throne, though their rule was short-lived. The Tannite dynasty later took power in Lower Egypt, while Ethiopia remained a rival center of authority at Napata. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, powerful Ethiopian kings like Pianki and Taharka once more conquered Egypt, ruling as pharaohs and welcomed by the people as liberators. Their dominance, however, ended with the advance of Assyrian armies, and Egypt soon fell into the hands of foreign powers. Psammetichus, of Libyan origin, briefly restored native rule, but only by relying on Greek mercenaries and marrying into Ethiopian royalty. With his reign, Egypt opened itself to foreign influence more than ever before. Many of its soldiers deserted to Ethiopia rather than serve under foreign officers. By the time of Nectanebo, the last native king, the treasury was carried into Ethiopia as Persia prepared its conquest. Soon after, Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BC and was hailed as a deliverer. He founded Alexandria, which under the Ptolemies became the intellectual and commercial center of the Mediterranean. The dynasty ended with Cleopatra, whose alliance with Rome postponed Egypt's fate only briefly. Upon her death, Egypt became a Roman province. Christianity spread through the land, later suppressed and revived, until the Arab conquest in the 7th century AD transformed the land once again, making Cairo a great capital of faith and learning. We could trace the succession of rulers down to modern times, but the real aim here is to follow the more ancient connections between Egypt and the Kushite Empire of Ethiopia. Toward the end of the Ethiopian dynasties, great public works were still being carried out. Canals and embankments were built to keep towns above the floods of the Nile. Hosea, king of Israel, once sent gifts to Shabaka, whose sister Ameneritis was a woman of unusual intelligence and influence. She served as regent 3 times, a sign of the respect given to women under Ethiopian rule, and was particularly beloved at Thebes. Shabaka himself abolished capital punishment, replacing it with forced labor. In Luxor, he is depicted making offerings to the gods of Thebes as a legitimate sovereign. Around 693 BC, Tarkaka built the great temple of Gebel Barkal, and many pyramid reliefs show Ethiopian rulers claiming the title of Lord of the Two Lands, bearing the same symbols and throne names long associated with Egypt, such as Amen and Ra. Inscriptions like Ankh-Kara, Alu Amen, and Amen-Ark-Neb demonstrate that Nubia and Egypt were ruled together as one land for ages far earlier than the narrow period usually assigned to the Ethiopian dynasty. The peoples of Asia Minor, the South Caspian, and the Mediterranean basin were closely related to Egypt, sharing the cranial features of Upper Egypt. Ancient Egyptian war scenes even depict distant nations with red hair, blue eyes, and tattooed legs resembling old Scythian traits, perhaps not outsiders at all, but northern branches of the same Kushite stock, altered by distance. The sweeping conquests of Egyptian kings seem less improbable when understood as a reclaiming of old Kushite lands. Records describe Amenophis, the Memnon of legend, taking the whole Arabian, Libyan, and Ethiopian coasts, reaching into Bactria in the east, and subduing Scythic peoples in the Caucasus. He marched into Colchis, itself considered Ethiopian, and advanced as far as the Don. These were all ancient Kushite dominions. Legends of Hercules' passage reflect the early colonization of Western Europe by this race. Other accounts speak of the Ethiopian leader Simandas leading vast armies against the Bactrians, while the triumphs of Osiris were said to stretch from the Ganges to the Danube. Even Western Europe remembered in myth the passage of Bacchus and Dionysus, echoes of those early Ethiopian campaigns. Arabia was once part of the ancient Kushite world, and some scholars even suggest it may have been the earliest seat of Ethiopian civilization. Standard histories and encyclopedias shed little light on the earliest races of Arabia, just as earlier accounts of Greece have been rewritten after archaeology revealed influences from other peoples. Arabia, too, demands such a reevaluation. The ancients divided the land into three parts: Petrea, the stony land; Deserta, the desert; and Felix, the happy or fertile. These boundaries were never precisely marked, and even today, much of Arabia remains a mystery. The southwest, including Yemen, has always stood out for its fertile soil and favorable climate, and for centuries it preserved the last blossoms of a once flourishing civilization that did not arise from the Semitic peoples who now dominate the land. Arabia Deserta was the domain of Semitic nomads. Arabia Petrea, lying south of the Holy Land, was once inhabited by Edomites, Amalekites, Cushites, and other related groups. Arabia Felix, farther south and bounded by the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and ocean, was famous for its riches, spices, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Protected by deserts and mountains, Arabia was never truly conquered and retained its independence through the ages. The central plateau of Nejd became the stronghold of Arabian tradition and the pride of its people, especially for its groves of date palms and the valued coffee plant. Arabia as a whole can be seen as a continuation of the African Sahara: 1/3 mountains and coast, 1/3 fertile plateau, and 1/3 desert. Two distinct races shaped Arabia: an early Kushite population and later Semitic tribes. The Kushites were the first settlers, long before Abraham's time. Their original homeland was the southwestern corner of the peninsula, from which they spread across Yemen, Hadramaut, and Oman. Their ruling race was known as the Himyar, meaning dusky, and their lost Himyaritic language has been shown to be closely related to Abyssinian tongues. Ancient writers remembered the Idites as descendants of Ham, and traditions still link the culture of Yemen and its institutions to Africa. Even physical traits of the inhabitants, shape of head, build, complexion, point to African origins. Like their Kushite kin in Egypt, they created great works of engineering, such as the vast reservoir of Meroë. They were settled people, fond of agriculture, trade, and the arts, and preferred village life to the wandering existence of the Bedouin. Close ties with Africa are reflected in the ease with which they intermarried across the Red Sea, a custom still common in the region. By contrast, the Semitic Arabs came later and occupied the harsher, more sterile portions of the land. They lived as nomads, wandering with their herds, hostile to agriculture and resistant to organized rule. Quarrels over wells and pastures shaped their history, just as the Bible recounts the parting of Abraham and Lot. Out of need, many became raiders of caravans. Unlike the settled Kushite Arabs, these tribes preserved little memory of Arabia's earlier geography or civilization. They traced their descent to Haber and Abraham, and Ishmael's descendants in particular came to dominate much of the land. The Quraysh tribe, claiming descent from Ishmael through Hagar, were closely linked with southern Kushite groups and carried on the idol worship at the Kaaba in Mecca. Most Ishmaelites lived as the Bedouins still do, stretching their domains from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. Fierce and independent, they would not marry into settled tribes and resisted subjugation. The Semitic Arab, unlike his Kushite or Hebrew neighbor, was restless and warlike. His life was filled with peril, and his proud independence often took the form of unrestrained vengeance. Tribal feuds could smolder for generations, ignited by the retelling of some old grievance. Their hand was against every man, and every man's hand against them. Yet alongside this ferocity lay a tradition of hospitality. The Bedouin welcomed strangers who trusted themselves to his tent, offered them food and protection, and sent them away with gifts. This mixture of harshness and generosity shows how environment and hardship mold human nature. Where fertile lands nurtured gentleness and the arts, barren deserts often gave rise to fierceness and constant strife. The earlier account of Arabia and its people offers only part of the picture, focusing mainly on the Semitic element while overlooking other races and conditions. Later explorations and research reveal a far richer story. In 1862, Palgrave journeyed through Arabia and found, beyond the wandering Bedouins and desert wastes, a land of striking fertility and beauty. Baldwin likewise reported that much of Arabia was settled, with towns, villages, and organized governments, remnants of a long and ancient culture. Central Arabia, he noted, was a vast, fertile plateau encircled by deserts, home to stable communities of Kushite Arabians. It was here that the famed Arabian horse was bred, perfected over thousands of years into a creature unmatched for endurance, beauty, and speed. Naturalists agree that Arabia was the true homeland of the horse, from which spread the Barb, Spanish, and English breeds. Alongside the horse, the camel was also perfected here, its unique endurance and ability to store water making it indispensable for desert life and commerce. Known as the ships of the desert, camels enabled trade to cross the barren sands, binding together Arabia and surrounding lands. The Kushite Arabians carried the oldest and purest bloodlines of the peninsula. They were the creators of its ancient civilization, still visible in the vast ruins scattered across the land. Around 3000 to 3500 BC, when Ethiopians were rising to power in Egypt, Western Arabia was already divided into great kingdoms ruled by Kushite princes. These rulers of Yemen, often called Himyarites, reigned for thousands of years. Their name, meaning dusky, pointed to African origins, and their language was closely related to Abyssinian. In Yemen, they built reservoirs like that of Marib, constructed great cities, and developed trade routes that carried goods from India and Africa into Syria, avoiding the Red Sea. Classical writers such as Strabo, Pliny, and Diodorus noted Yemen's wealth, commerce, and advanced culture. Literature and the arts flourished there long before the rise of Islam, and their national chronicles confirm this heritage. For nearly 2,500 years, the kings of Yemen, known as Tobas, ruled the southern half of the peninsula and collected tribute from the north. Their institutions resembled those of the Nile Valley, and their power reached as far as Central Asia and Africa. Some even claimed conquests near the frontiers of China. Yet alongside this high civilization remained the desert tribes, the Semitic Arabs, who had come from the north. These nomadic groups spoke a language akin to Hebrew and Syriac, and had little interest in agriculture, architecture, or the arts. They lived a pastoral, wandering life, often clashing with settled peoples, but for centuries they remained subject to the powerful Kushite monarchies of the south. In the 5th century AD, the Semitic tribes began to assert themselves, rebelling against Yemenite rule and narrowing the territory of the older Kushite kingdoms. By the 6th century, the Quraysh tribe was rising to prominence. Claiming descent from Ishmael, they intertwined their lineage with the older Kushite tribes and appropriated much of their heritage. Later, Islamic chroniclers, writing long after these events, blurred and altered the older traditions, attributing to themselves the glories of Kushite Arabia. Yet archaeology and early records reveal that Arabian civilization stretched back thousands of years before the Semitic rise, and that it had been Kushite in origin. By 3000 BC, Arabian civilization rivaled Egypt and Babylon. The 82 kingdoms of Arabia flourished and fell, with traditions recalling disasters such as the Flood of Arem that destroyed Meroë and scattered the tribes. For centuries afterward, Semitic tribes lived under Kushite law and influence, adopting much of their culture even as they slowly grew in power. Eventually, they overthrew their teachers, but the memory of Kushite superiority lingered. Many Sabaeans, when their power waned, migrated to Abyssinia, carrying with them the old speech of Yemen, preserved in the language of Ge'ez. Arabia's independence was legendary. Neither Alexander the Great nor the Romans succeeded in conquering it. When Aelius Gallus led a Roman force against Yemen, the soldiers succumbed to the heat and could not capture Meroë. For thousands of years, Arabia defied foreign domination. Only with the exhaustion brought on by the later Islamic conquests did the peninsula become vulnerable, eventually falling under Turkish control. Yet the legacy of Arabia's Kushite past remained. From its ancient empire had once spread arms, commerce, and culture across half the world. From the Indus to the Atlantic, from the deserts of Africa to the vineyards of France. The later triumphs of the Semitic Arabs followed in the paths first blazed by their Kushite predecessors, building upon an older foundation laid by the Black Empire of the Ethiopians. Arabia was among the earliest colonies of the Kushite Empire, and many early writers regarded it as the original homeland of Kush. In the oldest traditions, Arabia was described as Ethiopia, a land of wealth and power long before Egypt or Chaldea rose to prominence. It was separated from Africa only by the Red Sea, making it natural for the people of the Upper Nile to send colonies across and establish flourishing cities and settlements along the Arabian coast. These events took place before Memphis was founded, or Chaldea was settled. The scriptures connect Arabia with many of the most striking episodes of divine history. It was here that Job, the greatest man of the East, lived. Here Moses found refuge after fleeing Egypt, married into a Kushite family, and encountered God in the burning bush. Here Elijah was fed by ravens. And here, after the Exodus, Israel witnessed the signs and wonders of divine presence in the desert. Arabia was also the land from which descended the two great religious traditions that proclaimed one supreme God, the Hebrews and the followers of Muhammad. The north was occupied by early Semitic tribes, while southern Arabia remained in the hands of the older and more advanced Kushite peoples. In Yemen, Hadramaut, and Oman, these Ethiopic Arabians established powerful kingdoms and built marvels of engineering such as the Great Reservoir at Meroë. They lived settled lives, built cities, and cultivated the soil, standing apart from the nomadic character of the later Semitic Bedouin. Their rulers, known as the Himyarites, left behind inscriptions in an ancient language akin to Abyssinian, revealing their African origins. Archaeologists and classical writers alike testify that Yemen and the South once held immense wealth. Frankincense and myrrh, pearls and gold filled their markets. Their houses, temples, and palaces were richly adorned with silver, gold, ivory, and precious stones, while their ports at Oman and Aden bustled with commerce, linking Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. Writers of antiquity described the Sabaeans as surpassing all neighboring nations in magnificence, and their country was famed for uninterrupted peace and prosperity. Pliny called them the richest of nations, and Alexander the Great himself declared that Arabia was second to none in the world. The ruins of their civilization, vast embankments, tanks, and colossal structures, still astonish travelers. The city of Saba was in ruins even before the time of Christ, and the origins of the Meroë reservoir were lost to memory in the days of Solomon. These Kushite Arabians, remembered as the Adites or men of Ad, were often described in legend as giants and builders of marvelous palaces, their tales giving rise to many of the stories later retold in Arabian Nights. Tradition traced their descent to Ad, a grandson of Ham, and to Himyar, son of Seba, son of Kush. These people were related to the early Akkadians of Mesopotamia and to the Ethiopians of Abyssinia. They were tall, dark, and powerful, contrasting sharply with the smaller and more nomadic Semitic Arabs who arrived later. Over time, the shrines and temples of this Kushite civilization were destroyed by the northern tribes, and later by Islamic reformers. But scattered monuments, inscriptions, and even great stone circles remain as silent witnesses of their vanished glory. Arabia's oldest civilization, like that of Egypt and Babylon, was Kushite in origin, and its memory lived on in legend, long before the rise of the Saracens and the Mohammedan conquest. Across Arabia lie the remains of a once great civilization, now scattered and half-buried beneath sand and time. Ruins of lofty stone buildings, fragments of pottery, and inscriptions in the ancient Himyaritic tongue testify to a culture that was African in its origins, unrelated to the later Semitic speech of the Bedouin. In Yemen, whole mountainsides were terraced from summit to base, with walls rising sometimes 15 feet high, an astonishing proof of the agricultural genius and perseverance of the Kushite peoples. They built massive dikes and reservoirs that allowed them to irrigate fields even in seasons of drought, raising cultivation to a level of perfection unknown to the later nomadic tribes. By contrast, the Semitic Arab showed little inclination for agriculture, preferring the pastoral life of shepherds and wanderers, which has never produced the foundations of higher culture. Religion among these earlier inhabitants took the form of Sabaeanism, a faith without idols or priesthood, rooted in the worship of the stars from elevated places. This ancient cult, spread by Kushite migrations, appeared not only in Arabia, but in Egypt, India, Rhodesia, and even Western Europe. It was likely through this sky-gazing tradition that astronomy first developed, and pyramids and high places across the world may have served as sacred observatories. Ancestor worship was also deeply rooted, linking the people of Arabia with the old race of the Upper Nile, whose migrations reached far into Europe. Legends like those of Sinbad the Sailor preserve memories of Kushite mariners whose ships once traversed the ancient world. These sailors mapped distant lands, their charts passing into the hands of later navigators, even containing outlines of regions like Western Europe and the Americas, long before the age of Columbus. The original Arabians were Kushites, builders of cities, cultivators of the soil, masters of trade, and founders of a brilliant civilization. The Semitic Arabians arrived much later, pastoral and warlike, living in tents, constantly quarreling over pastures and wells, and lacking the stability to produce enduring culture. Their religion under Muhammad reflected this background, spreading by the sword and offering the rewards of plunder to converts. Victories were won with merciless severity, as when entire communities were executed or forced into submission. Yet Muhammad also embodied discipline and simplicity, despising luxury, prohibiting wine, and upholding certain moral standards. After his death, his followers swept outward, conquering Persia, Syria, Egypt, and beyond. The conquest of Egypt brought the destruction of the Alexandrian library, where thousands of precious books were burned over many months, erasing untold knowledge of the ancient world. Carthage fell to the flames, and the Moors, themselves descended from Kushite stock, joined forces with Arabs to invade Spain. In 712, thousands crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and within a short time, Spain absorbed the culture and manners of its conquerors. With Kushite blood in both Moors and many Arabians, the union produced a rich and prosperous civilization that flourished in Spain for centuries. At its height, the empire of the Saracens stretched from India to the Atlantic, uniting Moors, Persians, and Hindus under the banner of Islam. Yet even this vast dominion faced defeats, as in the failed sieges of Constantinople, where Greek defenses and the dreaded Greek fire broke their fleets. Despite such setbacks, the Semitic Arabians left an enduring mark upon the lands they conquered. But it must not be forgotten that behind them lay an older and greater legacy, that of the Kushite Arabians, whose civilization had flourished for thousands of years before the rise of Islam. The salvation of Constantinople came through the terrifying force of Greek fire, a weapon so mysterious and effective that it altered the course of history. Guarded closely by the Byzantine rulers, it was said to have been first devised by a Kushite Arabian before its secret was purchased by the emperor. The blinding flames, which the Arabs could neither withstand nor comprehend, spread panic among their fleets and armies. In time, however, the knowledge of this weapon was stolen and turned back upon the Christians during the later holy wars in Syria and Egypt. Its use marked one of the great turning points in the evolution of warfare. Meanwhile, the Saracens pressed westward into Gaul. Their first thrust was repelled by the combined forces of Goths, Gascons, and Franks under the leadership of the Duke of Aquitaine. But in a later invasion, they swept through the land, pillaging churches and spreading terror. Europe stood on the brink of being remade. Had they triumphed, the teachings of the Quran might have been heard in Oxford rather than the Bible. Deliverance came through Charles Martel, the Duke of the Franks, who with German allies met them in the heart of France. After 7 days of battle, the Saracen leader fell. Their forces broke apart, and the victory of the Franks was decisive. Aquitaine was restored, and the Christian world was preserved from conquest. At the same time, Arabia itself was torn apart by disputes over succession to Muhammad. 3 rival caliphs contested authority, while in Baghdad, the rulers sought to rival the luxury of the ancient Persian kings. Immense sums were squandered on palaces, jewels, and ornaments of astonishing extravagance. Golden trees with mechanical birds, vast collections of tapestries, and hundreds of lions kept in regal display evoked the spirit of the Arabian Nights. In Cordova, the caliphs of Spain matched such magnificence, surrounding themselves with armies and halls encrusted with gold and pearls. Yet this very luxury corroded the empire, sapping its strength. Harun al-Rashid, remembered as a hero in legend, extended conquests across Asia Minor and into the Mediterranean, seizing Crete and Sicily. Later, Saracen fleets reached the Tiber itself, plundering Rome's sacred treasures. Constantinople, too, suffered renewed assaults, and though it held firm, the fury of the Arab armies left devastation in their wake. But as the Arab conquerors settled in foreign lands, they began to lose the hardy independence of the desert. Their caliphs increasingly relied on Turkish mercenaries who soon seized power for themselves, even murdering their patrons. By the 9th century, new religious movements arose, loosening the bonds of traditional Islam and stirring rebellions among the Bedouin tribes. These fanatics swept through cities like Raqqa, Baalbek, and Basra, wreaking havoc upon the empire. At the same time, the sheer size of the dominion made it impossible to govern. Provinces slipped away, and the caliphs, once lords of the Eastern world, were reduced to misery and humiliation. By the middle of the 10th century, the Caliph of Baghdad had been dragged from his throne, blinded, and cast into a dungeon. Though the Abbasids occasionally regained a measure of power, their authority was steadily eroded by rivals. The Fatimids, claiming descent from Muhammad's daughter, rose in North Africa and extended their sway over Egypt and beyond. The Byzantines seized the chance to push deep into Syria, briefly restoring Christian rule to ancient cities. By then, however, the great wealth of Baghdad was long dissipated through extravagance and corruption. The empire of the caliphs, once the terror of Europe and Asia, dwindled into weakness, and by the 16th century, the claim to the caliphate had passed to the Ottoman sultans, who declared themselves leaders of the Muslim world. Gibbon described the period before Muhammad as an age of ignorance, and this may be true when speaking of the Semitic Arabians. Yet more recent study has revealed that Arabia's literary heritage reached far deeper, drawing upon older traditions. Accounts tell us that while Arabia may seem poor in monuments, it was in fact abundant in manuscripts. Verses survive that were dedicated to the kings and heroes of Yemen, dated over 1,000 years before the Christian era. Poetry from those early centuries displayed polish and refinement, with metrical forms of striking elegance that rivaled the best of later ages. The nomadic tribes had no literature before the rise of Islam, but in southern Arabia, an older culture had already nurtured it. The language of this early poetry was not the Arabic of Muhammad, but the older Himyaritic tongue of Yemen. Traditions speak of a national gathering near Mecca at Okad, a great fair that resembled the Olympiads of Greece. Lasting for 30 days before the annual pilgrimage, it combined commerce with contests of eloquence and poetry. The finest poems were even inscribed in golden letters and hung in the Temple of Mecca. By the 4th and 5th centuries, poetry had become a highly cultivated art. Antar, Amr el-Kais, Tarafa, and others gained renown at these festivals. Later followers of Muhammad, however, swept aside such traditions, abolishing the old gatherings in their zeal. This fair, with its horse races, music, and poetic recitals, grew from the refined life of the earlier Kushite Arabians. Some of the greatest poets of Arabia left works that rival the finest of any land. Legends such as those of Antar, and later the tales that came together as the Arabian Nights, were born out of this tradition and became part of the literature of the world. The flourishing of Saracen culture after Muhammad was possible only because the Semitic element was joined to the older Kushite root, giving the language richness, softness, and variety. It was this blended tongue that spread with Islam across Western Asia, Northern Africa, and even southern Spain. Mohammedan writers, however, were too late and too bound by religious prejudice to preserve faithfully the memory of the older Kushite civilization. They took over its monuments and treasures, but often obscured the truth of its origins. The Quraysh, the tribe of Muhammad, claimed the legacy of the temple at Mecca by seizing what had long been the shrine of Kushite piety, filled with gold and jewels offered through centuries. Their annals carefully reshaped history, portraying themselves as the true heirs, while the genuine culture had belonged to the Yemenite Arabs. The brilliance of Arabian poetry and language was not the work of the nomadic Semites alone, but was rooted in the deep soil of the Kushite tradition. The Himyaritic tongue had left its mark, and its alphabet resembled that of Ethiopia. Trade and contact between related peoples meant that Hebrews, Ethiopians, and Kushite Arabs could converse and exchange ideas with ease. It was through this cultural stream that Moses, Solomon, and others could engage with peoples of southern Arabia and Ethiopia. Even Christ's conversation with the Samaritan woman reflects this blending of tongues. What emerges is the recognition that the richness of Arabic as a vehicle for poetry, philosophy, and imaginative literature was not born from the austere life of desert nomads, but from the inheritance of a far older civilization. The tales of enchantment, the imaginative imagery, and the artistic flowering of the language were the legacy of Kushite Arabian culture. These stories, passing westward, fueled the growth of art and literature in Europe. When the Arabian Nights appeared in European languages, they opened a new world of wonder. Yet their roots lay in the earlier Kushite Empire, whose cultural seeds had been scattered wide by conquest and trade long before Muhammad's time. The Arabian Nights remains one of the most extraordinary works of world literature, belonging to that class of creations which are imperishable. The genius of the Arabian writers lay in their grandeur of imagination, their power to stir the emotions, and the intensity with which they expressed both love and hate. When carried westward by the Saracens, this literature left a profound imprint on the poetry and letters of Europe. Arabian philosophy and ideals also influenced the religious and intellectual life of Persia, Turkey, and all the lands touched by Islam. The Arabs gave Europe not only poetry, but also science. They introduced the numerical system that made calculation simple, including the 9 digits and the concept of zero, and they raised algebra to the status of a true science. Long before, an Ethiopian named Ames had written mathematical problems resembling algebra as early as 1700 BC. But the Arabs refined and expanded this knowledge, surpassing the Greeks and solving quadratic and cubic equations by the 10th century. They advanced astronomy and geography, building upon the experiences of their ancestors who had navigated trade routes across oceans and deserts. Lucian believed that their forebears were the first to chart the heavens, guided by clear skies and sharp intellect. Arabian science and learning flourished especially in medicine, chemistry, and the arts. They pioneered surgical instruments, advanced pharmacy, and preserved countless medical recipes still recognizable today. Their universities in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordova drew students from across Europe centuries before the West possessed anything beyond monastic schools. Libraries in these cities held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, carefully copied and preserved, while their schools taught grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and experimental science. Their architecture, with domes, arches, and minarets, inspired builders from Spain to India, and their craftsmen excelled in glassmaking, porcelain, silk weaving, and metalwork. Damascus blades, Cordovan leather, Toledo armor, and Granada silks testified to their skill. They passed on to Europe the mariner's compass, paper, new methods of dyeing, and perhaps even gunpowder. Among the most beloved figures of Arabian romance was Antar the Lion, a black poet and warrior who embodied the ideals of knighthood long before such notions appeared in medieval Europe. His story, celebrated for centuries across the Arab world, combined poetry, heroism, and chivalry, and became a source of inspiration for European tales of romance and honor. The Saracens also carried westward advanced knowledge of agriculture, irrigation, and botany, introducing crops like sugarcane, rice, cotton, and citrus fruits, along with new techniques of cultivation. In every field, literature, science, philosophy, art, and agriculture, the Arabs served as a bridge between the ancient world and the modern. They preserved knowledge, perfected it, and spread it far beyond their borders. As one historian noted, while their empire of the sword was vast, the empire of their mind reached even further, shaping the learning, imagination, and progress of later ages. Even today, the legacy of the Arabians can be seen in language, architecture, agriculture, and science, though many modern histories fail to give full credit to the true foundations laid by the older Kushite and settled Arabian traditions. The conquering tribes carried the zeal of conquest, but it was the princes and thinkers of Yemen who infused these campaigns with a deeper genius, transforming mere military victories into conquests of culture. Ancient Chaldea rose as early as Egypt, effectively a twin offshoot of an older source. By 5000 BCE, the region was dotted with city-states whose earliest civilized inhabitants, the Sumerians, created cuneiform, later taken over by incoming Semites, while the older tongue survived in temple rites into the age of Alexander. Many scholars trace the first impulses of this culture to southern Susiana and Elam, where picture signs evolved into wedge writing before flowering in Babylonia. The north was known as Akkad, centered on Babylon. The south as Sumer, with cities like Erech and Ur. To the north of Akkad lived Semitic tribes that later fed Assyria, while Elamite and Kassite incursions added further layers. Excavations have increasingly confirmed that ancient traditions align with the material record. Early lists name 10 primordial rulers, mirroring patterns in Egyptian and Hebrew lore, whose vast reigns run down to the flood hero remembered by the Greeks as Sisuthros. After this cataclysm, colonists under a Titan figure identified with Nimrod appeared on the Sumerian plain and undertook the sky-reaching tower later associated with Babylon's great sanctuary of Anu. Heroic cycles about Gilgamesh, linked by later ages with Melkart and Hercules, recur across Egypt, Greece, and Chaldea, hinting at a shared ancestry behind these names. In this framework, Bel-Nimrod connects Babylonia with the peoples of the Upper Nile, explaining why old geographers used Ethiopia loosely for swaths of Media, Susiana, Persia, and Aria between the Indus and the Tigris. Hebrew records likewise group Chaldeans, Ethiopians, and Egyptians as kindred, and philology and archaeology bear that out. Early inscriptions from Susiana reach back before 3200 BCE and show a language closer to southern Arabian Himyaritic than to later Semitic Babylonian. From the beginning, Babylonia mixed two Kushite-rooted elements, northern Akkadians and southern Sumerians. Human remains and reliefs indicate dark populations with elongated, upper Nile-type crania. Attempts to class them as Turanian founders do not hold linguistically. The Turanians, an ancient Japhetic branch spread across Eurasia, cultivated star worship and technical skill, yet lacked the spiritual tone of the earliest Chaldean faith. Their imprint appears later. Classical and Near Eastern writers identify Bel-Tonshu-Nimrod as son of Kush, founder of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, and even associate him with Ninus of Assyria. Place names from the Tigris eastward preserve the memory of Bel and Kush in forms that survive into modern geography, while Hebrew and Armenian traditions describe the first Babylonians as a subdivision of the Kushite family. Over time, admixture with Turanian and Aryan elements grew. Still, the kings whose monuments survive share one script, religion, and tradition, evidence of long cultural continuity. The earliest cities already display a mature civilization. Ur seems to have been a prime capital. The coastal origin of the first settlers suggests arrival by sea. Nimrod's renown permeated the region, proverbial in Mosaic times, deified at home, prominent in Arab lore, and attached to mounds and ruins throughout Mesopotamia. Stratigraphy shows successive cities buried beneath older ones, pushing the timeline back toward antediluvian horizons and matching the flood tablets' claim that survivors rebuilt on earlier foundations. Several 19th-century explorers argued that a south-to-north migration from East Africa via Arabia reached the Euphrates before recorded history, calling these settlers Akkadians in the Genesis sense. Reliefs from Nineveh depict two African-looking types, one the classic elongated Kushite visage, the other a heavier southern form akin to Upper Nile populations, consistent with the presence of such peoples in Susiana and Babylonia. An influential Babylonian priest, Berossus, translated his nation's records into Greek and described early times when scattered barbarous tribes lived without government until Bel intervened. Legends tell that a strange being, part man, part fish, emerged from the sea to instruct humankind in letters and the arts. Most plausibly a memory of mariners arriving in ships with animal prows, misunderstood by shore-dwellers who had not yet mastered the sea. Such stories preserve the image of a civilizing wave reaching the alluvial plain from the south, teaching crafts, law, and worship to unlettered locals, before later Semitic powers consolidated at Nineveh and forged the Assyrian profile known from history. The old legend tells of a strange being that rose each morning from the sea, spent the day among men, and returned to the waters at night. It ate no food of the locals because those who came were a more advanced people, supplied from their own ships. To the primitive tribes, it appeared as a fish-like god, yet its real role was that of teacher. It instructed in language, science, agriculture, surveying of land, the building of temples and cities, the arts, and the use of writing. In Babylonian tradition, this figure was Oannes, also called Anu, ruler of the underworld, whose chief sanctuary was at Erech. At Nippur, his name was preserved in Tel Anu. This same fish race carried knowledge into Egypt, for both lands were branches of the same cultural stream. By contrast, Turanians and Semites at that time remained nomadic, without cities or arts, long after Chaldea had risen. Even as late as Persia and Assyria's prime, they were still regarded as uncivilized. Such traditions of fish gods, often seen in totemic form across Africa, are less myth than memory of early seafaring people bringing order to untaught tribes. It shows that civilization in Mesopotamia did not arise in isolation, nor from Turanian or Semitic stock, but came from an older source. In inscriptions, Ethiopia is called Meroë, and its maritime activity is clearly noted. The root of Chaldean culture must have been the Kushite center on the Upper Nile, long remembered as the first cradle of mankind. Scholars of early navigation point out that Kushite Ethiopians were sailors and merchants in the remotest ages. Their command of the seas allowed them to plant colonies across 3 continents. They are even said to have circumnavigated the globe in antiquity, leaving charts and instruments that later passed to the Phoenicians, who claimed kinship with them. Everywhere the Kushites carried progress in industry, science, and belief. In Mesopotamia, they established new cities, one of which bore the name Kush. Even the Assyrian sculptures of later times reveal traces of Ethiopian blood, showing figures with tightly curled hair and features of African type. The earliest Chaldean centers arose on the shores of the Persian Gulf, with cities like Ur, Eridu, Larsa, and Erech. Ur, originally at the mouth of the Euphrates, was famous for its great moon temple, the oldest in the land. Over the centuries, the Gulf retreated, leaving the city far inland, a measure of the immense antiquity of these foundations. In the beginning, moon worship, rooted in the Sudan, was preeminent. The moon god was seen as father of the sun. Later, as Kushite power grew, the cult of Amun-Ra took precedence, for Amun was Kush himself. Across Babylonia rose vast sanctuaries to Istar and Bel, counterparts of Isis and Osiris in Egypt. Ur became the first capital to unite the scattered principalities. Claims that Babylon was ruled by early Aryans are contradicted by both ancient testimony and the inscriptions. Aryans had not yet crossed the great central deserts at that time. Babylonia and Assyria were from the outset distinct, the former Kushite, the latter in later times overtaken by Semitic tribes. Classical writers consistently emphasized their separateness. Greek historians linked Susiana to Ethiopia, with Memnon remembered as both a king of Susa and of the Upper Nile, uniting east and west. In Egypt, he was identified with Amenhotep III, and his famous statue was known as the Vocal Memnon. Legends told of his presence at Troy, where he died a hero. Thus the name Memnon bound together Ethiopia in Asia and Africa as one sphere of influence. Nippur, once called Belus, was Chaldea's capital during much of its history. Kings ruled there as early as 4,500 BCE. Sargon of Agade, around 3,800 BCE, led one of the Kushite Arabian waves of conquest. His realm stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and he founded Babylon itself. Hammurabi, about 2,500 BCE, expelled the Elamites and built an empire acknowledged throughout Mesopotamia. He dug canals, strengthened irrigation, raised embankments against floods, and codified laws enforced by courts across the land. Later ages revered his reign as Babylon's golden era. His achievements bore the hallmarks of Kushite genius, engineering skill, administrative order, and devotion to justice. Around 1750 BCE, new invaders, the Kassites, descended from the mountains. They ruled for nearly 6 centuries, their kings bearing Kassite names and their gods entering the Babylonian pantheon. Yet their writing and institutions remained Kushite in type, suggesting they were not alien conquerors, but a later branch of the same stock, related to the Western Kushite peoples of the Aegean. Their dynasties intermarried with the Pharaohs of Egypt, further proving a kinship of blood and culture. Ancient testimony supports this. Biblical references link Chaldeans and Kasdim, and traditions trace their migration eastward from Kedem, near the Caucasus. Greek and Hindu sources remember the same race as Cassia, inhabiting that region in early times. Even today, remnants of their descendants are known there. Their long reign ended around 1207 BCE, but the memory of their Kushite origin remained in both scripture and tradition. The Khazdim were remembered in ancient tradition as descendants of a figure named Chassa, or Chassia, who was said to have lived before the Great Flood and whose name became tied to the Caucasus Mountains. The very term Caucasus, or Caucas, extended across the lands from India to the Mediterranean. On the frontiers of Persia lived the Kassi. Mount Cassius was found on the border of Egypt, and another in Syria. Titles like Cassius and Cassiopeus were often associated with Jupiter, the chief god of Rome. In Indian records, the Khazdim are mentioned as a people of antiquity, with their forefather described as Zeus Cassius, a figure of primeval times. Jupiter of Rome was the same as the Greek Zeus, who in turn was identified with Ammon, or Amun-Ra of Egypt. One of Zeus's names was Ethiops, or Ethiopian, reflecting the ancient belief that this god was none other than Kush, the biblical patriarch, who ruled over the vast Kushite dominion that once spread its colonies across 3 continents. From the Caucasus, where he had established his power, a branch of this people is thought to have migrated into Babylonia under Nimrod, the son of Kush. In this way, the Kassites of later movements are directly connected with the earliest Chaldean settlers. Looking northward from Babylonia, Assyria at first was not a separate realm, but merely a province of the southern kingdom, and this is confirmed by the fact that the earliest northern towns bore Akkadian names, showing their origin under Nimrod. Many authorities hold that Genesis 10:2 should be read as, "Out of that land, he, Nimrod, went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh," rather than attributing the founding of Nineveh to Asher, a son of Shem, who is mentioned much later in the record. Micah also calls Assyria the land of Nimrod, and classical writers such as Diodorus identified its founder as Ninus, a name recalling Nimrod. Excavations confirm this origin. The earliest language of the Assyrian inscriptions was the old Hamitic tongue of the Chaldeans. Only later, with the encroachment of Semitic tribes, did the language of daily use shift toward an early Arabic form, though the ancient tongue survived among priests and scholars. Even then, it was not until Ashurbanipal's time that translations were made into the new vernacular. The oldest bricks from the northern sites bear Babylonian stamps, proving that Assyria was colonized and administered from the south. It had no independent chronology before 1400 BCE, and no firmly established date before 930 BCE. Its royal families intermarried with those of Babylon, and its rulers bore titles like Bel, originally southern. The deities of early Assyria were also borrowed. The worship of Anu, Vul, and Sin echoed the Chaldean cults. In the early centuries, Assyria's strength lay not in original culture, but in military invention. By 1300 BCE, its kings were already warring against Babylon. By 1130 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser I extended his campaigns far east and west, rebuilding temples with spoils from conquest. Relations with Babylon alternated between alliance and hostility, and at times Babylon was able to turn the tables and seize Assyrian gods as trophies. Assyria reached its height under Shalmaneser and his successors, subduing Israel and deporting its people, only to see its empire weakened soon after by revolts and foreign invasions. Nineveh, with its colossal walls, moats, and neighboring cities, became one of the largest urban centers of the ancient world. But even its vast size could not save it from the combined onslaught of Babylonians and Medes. The downfall of Assyria came as much from within as from without. A culture that had borrowed heavily from the south eventually gave way to pride in conquest, cruelty, and excess. Its rulers gloried in terrible acts, flaying enemies, impaling captives, and depopulating regions, contrasting sharply with the Babylonians, whose Kushite heritage inclined them to build colonies, spread the arts, and foster religion. While Assyria contributed engines of war and organized armies, its spirit was that of a fierce northern people shaped by Semitic and nomadic blood, in contrast to the more humane and creative southern race. In the end, constant wars drained its strength, luxury sapped its vitality, and the Scythian invasions delivered the final blow. Civilization was preserved not through Assyria's brief reign of terror, but through the longer and more enduring legacy of the Kushite Babylonians, whose influence shaped the ancient world. The Khazdim were remembered in ancient tradition as descendants of a figure named Chassa, or Chassia, who was said to have lived before the Great Flood and whose name became tied to the Caucasus Mountains. The very term Caucasus, or Caucasus, extended across the lands from India to the Mediterranean. On the frontiers of Persia lived the Kassoi. Mount Cassius was found on the border of Egypt and another in Syria. Titles like Cassius and Cassiopeus were often associated with Jupiter, the chief god of Rome. In Indian records, the Khazdim are mentioned as a people of antiquity, with their forefather described as Zeus Cassius, a figure of primeval times. Jupiter of Rome was the same as the Greek Zeus, who in turn was identified with Ammon or Amen-Ra of Egypt. One of Zeus's names was Ethiops, or Ethiopian, reflecting the ancient belief that this god was none other than Kush, the biblical patriarch who ruled over the vast Kushite dominion that once spread its colonies across 3 continents. From the Caucasus, where he had established his power, a branch of this people is thought to have migrated into Babylonia under Nimrod, the son of Kush. In this way, the Kassites of later movements are directly connected with the earliest Chaldean settlers. Looking northward from Babylonia, Assyria at first was not a separate realm, but merely a province of the southern kingdom. And this is confirmed by the fact that the earliest northern towns bore Akkadian names, showing their origin under Nimrod. Many authorities hold that Genesis 10:2 should be read as, "Out of that land, he, Nimrod, went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh," rather than attributing the founding of Nineveh to Asher, a son of Shem, who is mentioned much later in the record. Micah also calls Assyria the land of Nimrod, and classical writers such as Diodorus identified its founder as Ninus, a name recalling Nimrod. By 5000 BCE, Mesopotamia was already filled with city-states, much like the later republics of Greece and Italy. The land's fertility was extraordinary. Ancient writers claimed grain returned 200-fold, sometimes 3. Wheat could even be harvested twice from a single sowing. Fruits, barley, sesame, palms, and other crops thrived naturally. Such abundance ensured rapid population growth and the rise of organized life. Archaeology has shown that Nippur served as a religious center for over 4 millennia, far longer than Rome ever stood at the center of Christendom. Across the region, countless mounds conceal the ruins of once great cities, evidence of the thriving nations that once filled the land. The inhabitants of early Mesopotamia were closely tied to the Kushite world. Ethiopia's influence reached into Persia, Assyria, and Syria, and the monuments of Elam, Babylon, and Baalbek show the same architectural tradition as the massive works of Egypt and India. The sculptures of the Hittites and Philistines reveal Ethiopian features, and the earliest inscriptions of Persepolis also point to a pre-Persian, Hamitic origin. The structures of Babylon were built on immense platforms to raise them above the damp land. The builders used sun-dried bricks for the bulk, with burnt bricks for the exterior, bound with bitumen cement that has survived the ages. Drainage systems, buttresses, and external ornamentation reveal advanced knowledge. Temples rose in stages, painted in vivid colors, and crowned with shrines that also served as observatories. Palaces, with open courts and massive gateways, stood nearby. Writers of antiquity marveled at Babylon's scale. Herodotus described its walls as 56 miles around, enclosing more than 200 square miles. Other accounts spoke of walls more than 300 feet high and wide enough for chariots to pass each other. 25 great gates of brass opened onto broad avenues, and 250 towers added strength. The Euphrates ran through the city, lined with quays and stairs, and crossed by a bridge. An enormous artificial lake, 40 miles square, regulated the river while the bridge was built. The most imposing structure of all was the Temple of Belus, nearly 500 feet high, rivaling the Great Pyramid. From its summit, one could look down on the vast city spread across the plain. The shrine once held colossal golden statues and priceless treasures, later taken by conquerors. The royal palace rivaled the temple in scale, enclosed by immense ramparts and gates of bronze. Within its walls rose the famous Hanging Gardens, one of the wonders of the world. Built by Nebuchadnezzar for his queen, who longed for her native mountains, the gardens rose in terraces 75 feet high, covered with deep soil that supported trees, flowers, and shrubs. A great hydraulic system lifted water from the Euphrates to the upper levels. From afar, the gardens looked like a wooded hill rising above the city walls, and from the highest terrace the king could survey his splendid capital. These works turned Babylon into the true emporium of the East. Her wealth, her temples, her palaces, and her treasures made her a city of unmatched grandeur. Ancient writers called her the Golden City, the glory of kingdoms, and the pride of the Chaldeans. Even after her fall, her ruins became quarries for later capitals, but the memory of her greatness survived as a symbol of human achievement and ambition. Through the grand avenues of Babylon once rolled the chariots of kings and princes, while from her splendid gates marched forth bronze-clad armies, seemingly invincible, to spread her dominion. Into those same gates were driven endless lines of captives from conquered lands, proof of her unmatched supremacy. In her pride, she proclaimed herself mistress of the world, but in time she too was humbled and cast down. No city built by human ambition and genius has suffered such total ruin. Babylon today lies buried in dust, her greatness remembered only in scattered mounds covered with grass and shrubs. One of these, Birs Nimrud, marks the remains of the great temple of Nebo, still rising despite the passing of 25 centuries. This structure symbolized Babylonian belief. 7 platforms, each dedicated to one of the planets, stood one upon another, painted in vivid colors. Black at the base, orange for Jupiter, red for Mars, a shining golden level for the Sun, yellow for Venus, blue for Mercury, and silver for the Moon. Some colors were fired into the bricks, others painted, while the levels for the Sun and Moon gleamed with plates of precious metal. From afar, when sunlight struck its brilliant bands, or when moonlight bathed it in softer glow, worshippers may well have believed the deity himself was enthroned above. Archaeological discoveries show that in these temples, offerings were made, sometimes even human sacrifice. The lowest layers have yielded copper and bronze vessels, alongside clay pottery decorated in red and black designs resembling early Greek work, akin to the art of the Minoans, yet belonging to an even older Ethiopian tradition. Such finds underline the antiquity and wide connections of this culture. Scholars like Rawlinson concluded that the Chaldeans resembled other Ethiopians and traced their roots to the Kushite peoples who spread from Africa into Arabia and onward into Mesopotamia and beyond. Baldwin emphasized that tradition and scripture alike point toward Africa as the original homeland of these people. The Bible itself traces Nimrod's descent from Kush, not the reverse. Babylonian records support this by speaking of an original dark-skinned race called Admi, remembered also in Arabian traditions as the Adites. Many scientists have recognized that the earliest human types were dark, with lighter complexions developing much later in colder regions. The civilization of Babylonia was contemporary with that of the Upper Nile. Some scholars trace Babylonian writing back as far as 6000 BCE. Inscriptions from as early as 3200 BCE confirm Kushite presence in Mesopotamia. Biblical references describe Havilah, son of Kush, as settling near the union of the Tigris and Euphrates. Hebrew scribes during their exile in Babylon recorded genealogies drawn directly from these ancient traditions. Ancient writers like Diodorus Siculus noted that the Chaldeans formed a learned priestly order comparable to the Egyptian priesthood, their time spent in study, observation, and interpretation of the heavens. They were famed for their wisdom, known as the wise men of the East, passing knowledge from father to son. Babylon became renowned for its schools, libraries, and temples filled with astronomical records and almanacs. The Chaldeans not only guided religion, but also directed the armies and affairs of state, producing the royal families themselves. They were the ruling caste, known elsewhere as Chayas or Kazdim, who held authority across the Kushite colonies. Their fame as astronomers and diviners spread widely. They believed matter eternal, with order and harmony brought forth by divine intelligence, and from their high rank they inherited priesthoods, governorships, and kingships. This tradition of wisdom gave Babylon her reputation as a land of learning. Ancient testimony described the Chaldeans as the earliest settled and organized people, spreading their influence from Egypt westward to the Ganges in the east. These were the Akkadians of Chaldea, their origins traced to the same Kushite cradle that nourished the civilizations of Africa and Asia. For a long time, scholars tended to underestimate the achievements of ancient civilizations, but the discoveries made in Egypt and Mesopotamia have revealed the splendor of ages once dismissed as myth, showing that what tradition called the Golden Age was indeed a period of extraordinary accomplishment. Writers such as Rawlinson emphasized that although Babylonia lacked many natural advantages, its people, particularly those of Hamitic descent, showed a remarkable energy, creativity, and inventiveness that placed them high among the nations of the world. Aristotle remarked that the beginning is more than half the whole, and so it must be acknowledged that the peoples who first laid down the foundations of law, art, and science deserve more than half the credit, for without their work, later generations could not have built upon it. To ignore this truth and ascribe all progress to modern times is both arrogant and short-sighted. A deeper study of earlier civilizations offers the best safeguard against decline. The Babylonians preserved traditions of creation and accounts of the antediluvian world. The narrative attributed to Berossus parallels the biblical account with striking closeness, describing a primal chaos of mingled elements, monstrous forms, and disorder until divine wisdom imposed order. Their sculpture often depicted these strange hybrid creatures, reflecting both myth and geological memory of a world once filled with monstrous beasts. These stories were not meaningless inventions, but attempts to preserve an understanding of primeval conditions. Both the Babylonian and Hebrew records recount a catastrophic flood, a divinely instructed survivor, the building of an ark, the sending forth of birds, and the offering of sacrifice afterward. Archaeology confirms that shipbuilding was already understood in those remote times. The mingling of Semitic and Hamitic peoples after the flood was close, and Abraham himself, though Semitic by paternal descent, may have had Kushite connections, for he was called a Chaldean and came from Ur. In later centuries, Hebrews often intermarried with Ethiopians. The Babylonian flood story predates the Hebrew version, yet rather than diminish the latter, it strengthens its authority by showing a common memory. A similar relationship is found between the Code of Hammurabi and the Mosaic Law, both reflecting a higher inspiration and remarkable parallels in principles of justice. Babylonian tablets even contain references to a coming savior centuries before the Christian era, revealing how deeply hope and prophecy were rooted in their thought. Babylonian religion centered on the planets, a practice clearly linked to Hamitic traditions. Yet alongside this polytheism ran hymns to a single supreme god, echoing ideas of divine unity. Their literature includes penitential psalms, remarkably close in spirit to those of Israel. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh reflects the same heroic cycle that later reappeared in Greece as the labors of Hercules. Their early religious writings date back to nearly 2000 BCE, and even then, they were preserving traditions from earlier ages. Over time, however, their beliefs became tainted with incantations, sorcery, and fear of evil spirits, practices that eventually contributed to their downfall. Many superstitions of the Middle Ages, from astrology to witchcraft, can be traced back to Babylon. Despite these distortions, their astronomy was originally scientific rather than superstitious. They observed comets, eclipses, and planetary movements with precision that astonished later scholars. Records preserved for nearly 2 millennia allowed Alexander the Great to find in Babylon an unbroken series of observations dating back to the 23rd century BCE. They calculated lunar eclipses with near-modern accuracy, divided the equator into 360 degrees, discovered the solar cycle, and named the months according to zodiacal signs. They devised a duodecimal system, calculated squares and cubes, and compiled tables that remain correct today. The calendar they perfected, with only slight alterations, is still the framework of our reckoning. Babylonian ingenuity extended to measuring time with dials, to systems of weights and measures indispensable for commerce, and even to optical instruments, as evidenced by the discovery of ancient lenses. In the field of writing, they were equally advanced. Early inscriptions were pictorial, but as clay became the medium, characters took on the wedge-shaped form we know as cuneiform. This script was later adopted by Semitic peoples, but it remained for centuries the sacred language of Babylonian religion. They also mastered the wheel and used horse-drawn vehicles from the earliest ages of their history, showing that many things we imagine to be inventions of modern times are merely inheritances from the distant past. As Solomon observed, there is nothing new under the sun, and the Babylonians stand as a lasting reminder of how much our civilization owes to the genius of antiquity. Babylon stood as one of the greatest centers of craftsmanship in the ancient world. Though modern societies have devised more complex machinery, their fabrics and artistry often fall short of the refinement achieved in those distant ages. The linen that wrapped Egyptian mummies remains unmatched in delicacy, and Babylonian gems display garments rich with intricate embroidery. The city's fame rested on its imperishable dyes, exquisite designs, and carpets more elegant than those produced anywhere else, while its cotton goods were woven with extraordinary skill. Some carvings were so minute that they suggest the use of magnification, leaving modern artisans puzzled at how such precise gem cutting was achieved. The Babylonians also pioneered the inlaying of metals and perfected the art of covering iron with bronze. Goldsmiths reached a level of mastery that continues to inspire envy, and their furniture reflected elegance and taste worthy of imitation. Law and order were as prominent as artistry. The Code of Hammurabi, dating back to around 2250 BC, reflects a highly developed sense of justice suited to an agricultural and commercial society. It clearly defined rights of person and property, set strict penalties for crimes, protected widows and orphans, and regulated inheritance and marriage. Merchants enjoyed broad connections with distant lands, while judges were forbidden to take bribes. Even family relationships were subject to law. Sons could be punished for denying their fathers, or exiled for rejecting their mothers. Municipal systems were highly organized, including taxation for public works, postal services, and even forms of banking. Contracts, leases, and deeds were meticulously drawn, witnessed, and sealed in temples. The Babylonians excelled in agriculture, using their vast network of canals under state supervision to irrigate fields and gardens. Their pottery ranged from simple wares to pieces surpassing the beauty of Greek vases, and they created countless tombs, often stacked in layers reaching great depths. They were skilled engineers, familiar with pulleys, levers, and rollers. Hydraulic devices were used to water the hanging gardens, one of the wonders of the world. Evidence also suggests they possessed lenses and understood magnification. Their tablets record zoological, botanical, and geological classifications, while their libraries housed works grouped and catalogued by subject. Many texts preserved the ancient Sumerian language, with translations arranged for study, showing a deliberate effort to maintain the heritage of earlier times. The Babylonians named the stars after the rulers of the Kushite Empire, a reminder that a people of African descent reached the heights of early scientific and cultural achievement. Over time, however, with the mingling of foreign blood and the rise of wealth and luxury, Babylonian society fell into moral decay. Writers described a city where money corrupted every bond, where wine and excess dissolved restraint, and where women abandoned modesty. Prophets warned that such wickedness would bring destruction, and in 539 BC, the Persians under Cyrus entered Babylon by diverting the Euphrates, seizing the river gates during a night of revelry. The city, thought impregnable, was taken with ease, its walls later dismantled, and by the time of Greek historians, it lay in ruins. Recent excavations at Kish have confirmed that the earliest Sumerians, who built the foundations of Babylonian civilization, were a black people of remarkable skill. Their artifacts, jewelry of exquisite workmanship, finely cut seals, pottery of rare beauty, and inlaid works of silver and lapis lazuli, prove that they were master artisans thousands of years before later civilizations rose. These discoveries reveal a people whose genius in law, art, science, and engineering left an enduring legacy to the world, even as their once great city crumbled into dust. The gradual stages of early craftsmanship show that the Sumerians, a non-Semitic people, not only created the first system of writing, but also advanced metallurgy, glazing, glassmaking, and other technical arts. Excavations of their tombs, which were brick-lined chambers of uneven depth, large enough to hold both the body and personal belongings, continue with difficulty, as many objects disintegrate when exposed to air. These burial sites, now buried under layers of soil and sand, appear as a series of linked mounds. Among the discoveries are hairpins with decorative heads made of precious stones and worked metal, found in nearly every one of the 50 or more opened graves. Some tombs contained slender copper and silver daggers with handles of wood or bone inlaid with silver. There were also silver medallions engraved with images of the rising sun, fillets of silver for elaborate hairstyles, finely cut cylindrical seals of silver, glass, copper, and stone once used for legal purposes, as well as clay and metal vessels, urns, stone and metal battle axes, and a variety of precious stones. One striking type of pottery bore molded handles shaped into the bust of Nintud, the Sumerian goddess of childbirth. Of all the metal objects uncovered, copper pieces survived best due to their purity, while other metals suffered from corrosion caused by the soil. Spindles and spinning wheels, evidence of the art of weaving wool, were also found in the tombs of women. The whorls, in particular, were beautifully crafted from porous white materials or shells, sometimes inlaid with lapis lazuli. Rings, bracelets, and other ornaments of copper and silver were often mounted with stones such as carnelian, hematite, jasper, rock crystal, and calcite. One striking white gem, resembling a pearl, dissolved before the excavator's eyes when exposed to air. Despite the wide variety of rare jewelry unearthed, no gold was discovered in these graves, suggesting that silver was the most prized metal of the time. Yet the later flourishing age of Kish under Babylonian influence was revealed in the remarkable discovery of a solid gold earring shaped like an opening pomegranate bud, an unmatched work of artistry found in a clay coffin dating to the 5th century BC. In early Asia, monarchies under absolute rulers were the common form of government, with kings often treated as divine figures. India, however, followed a different path in its earliest ages. During the early Buddhist era, the land was filled with aristocratic republics, a form of rule also seen in other Kushite regions. In India's more isolated environment, this communal system endured longer than elsewhere and left a lasting influence. It shaped the gentle character of the Hindu and provided the setting for extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievements. The crafts and lost arts of ancient India reveal a level of originality and skill that modern times still struggle to match. Contrary to later theories, the peoples whom the Aryans encountered were not primitive savages, but skilled and intelligent communities. Ancient sources describe the Kushite inhabitants of India as merchants, craftsmen, and thinkers, with a long tradition of culture. Even the name Hindu was linked to Ethiopia, and early traditions often traced Hind and Sind back to Kush. Some ancient writers described the Indians as the wisest of men, with Ethiopians as their descendants who carried forward this inherited wisdom. The separation of India from its parent Kushite stock occurred long before Aryan migrations and early Greek accounts associated the Indian seas with Ethiopians. Kushite settlers introduced the use of metals, replacing stone tools, and brought with them the knowledge of the arts. Funeral monuments across India, with stone circles and upright menhors, mirror those of North Africa. They created pottery, iron weapons, and gold ornaments at a very early stage. Later Greek envoys, such as Megasthenes, described Indians not as Aryans but as Kushite rulers, especially in the regions between Persia and the Hindu Kush. The very name India, meaning black, originally designated the land of Asiatic Ethiopians. The physical setting of India also shaped its civilization. Protected by towering mountains in the north, watered by the great rivers of the Ganges, Indus, and Brahmaputra, and enriched by tropical vegetation in the south, it was a land of extraordinary fertility. The variety of crops, rice, cotton, sugarcane, indigo, and a wealth of fruits and herbs made it one of the richest agricultural regions of the ancient world. Wildlife abounded, from elephants and antelope to tigers and snakes, adding both danger and majesty to the land. Over time, however, India grew overcrowded, and many districts became unable to sustain their populations. In ancient days, local families lived by their crafts and farming, but centuries of conquest and misrule broke down these older systems. In the earliest records, India appears as a land ruled by non-Aryan princes who carried on the old Kushite traditions. Despite theories of Aryan invasions, the ruling class remained largely non-Aryan well into historical times. The Dravidian-speaking peoples, representing this original stock, still preserve some of the earliest languages. Ancient texts reveal bitter struggles between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, the latter being the old royal line. Eventually, the Brahmins abandoned direct sovereignty and instead became guardians of sacred knowledge and priesthood. Evidence suggests that by the time of the Buddha, no race in India could claim to be purely Aryan, for centuries of blending had erased clear divisions. Long before Alexander, all Indians were described as dark-skinned, their features linking them to the old Kushite race. The Rig Veda, composed thousands of years before any Aryan group could have possessed advanced culture, describes a society of artisans, farmers, and warriors. These people were blacksmiths, goldsmiths, carpenters, and husbandmen. They fought in chariots, ate beef, and revered deities that were the same as those of Egypt, Chaldea, and Ethiopia. They built towns, practiced shipbuilding, and cultivated the land with skill. Such achievements could not have come from Semitic or Turanian nomads who lacked these arts. Instead, they were the legacy of the Kushite race, whose presence in India shaped the earliest civilization of the subcontinent and whose influence spread far beyond its borders. When the Hebrews departed from Egypt, they still lacked the skill of welding iron. In later times, Persians even employed Egyptians as carpenters. The Greeks and Romans of the earliest ages had not yet advanced beyond the use of caves and crude stone tools. If we turn to the Goths, who appeared on the plains of Western Europe as late as the Christian era, we find no resemblance to the traits revealed in the Rig Veda. They had no knowledge of metals, no temples, no priesthood, and not even the name of a single deity has survived. Their lives were coarse, devoted to feasting and drink, and they often sank into stupor beside their hearths. Their gods, Odin and Thor, were borrowed from older races. They had no tradition of agriculture, living instead as restless nomads. They cherished no communal institutions, but were intensely individualistic. Wherever they went, they shattered the works of older civilizations, but created nothing themselves. Even into the Middle Ages, they failed to develop the spiritual discipline or gentleness that marked the Hindu. By contrast, the Hindu priest was shaped by a life of discipline and ritual. His years were divided into stages: first family life, then retreat into the forest as a recluse devoted to prayer, then the path of the wandering ascetic who renounced all comforts and desires in pursuit of union with the divine. He lived on what was given to him, never lingered long in one place, refrained from wine, and rejected war. His life was one of restraint, meditation, and spiritual duty. The Brahmin caste embodied a people who held their authority not by military might, but by discipline, temperance, and learning. Dynasties came and went, new religions rose and fell, but the Brahmin endured, calm and unbroken, from the dawn of history. Even as late as the Greek and Scythian invasions between the 4th century BC and the 6th century AD, much of northern India was still in the possession of Kushite peoples. Their ruins are scattered across the land, testifying to their long reign. The Vedas themselves describe these Kushite rulers as wealthy, with cattle, forts, and cities, entering into alliances with native princes of their own blood. Some later interpretations, clouded by prejudice, tried to portray the Dravidian Kushites as lawless or irreligious, yet this is inconsistent with their history, for everywhere Kushites brought organized worship, law, and sacrifice. What those texts describe is not Kushite disorder, but their encounters with aboriginal tribes who had no such traditions. A careful reading of the Rig Veda reveals the familiar traits of Kushite Ethiopians. The Brahmins themselves, later custodians of these writings, were likely of mixed descent, and their alterations of the texts show that they were not the original authors. The earlier Kushite element is described as swift in battle, dark in color, and adorned with ornaments of bronze, copper, and gold. Today, their descendants remain most clearly represented by the Dravidian peoples of southern India, who number in the tens of millions and preserve much of the unmixed type. The Dravidians, still an essential division of Indian society, entered the land in ancient times through the Northwest Passage as part of the same wave of Kushite expansion that peopled Arabia, Egypt, and Chaldea. Their merchants once led Indian commerce. Great dynasties such as the Pandyas, the Nandas of Bihar, and the Mauryas under Chandragupta and his grandson Asoka sprang from this non-Aryan stock. Many names in Sanskrit tradition, Takshak, Naga, and Kok, carry African echoes. The Rajputs themselves, claiming descent from ancient rulers, preserve the name of Kush. Throughout Indian chronicles, we see alliances between Brahmins and Kshatriyas of Dravidian origin, showing how deeply intertwined these peoples became. The Puranas record the long dynasties of Pandya kings, while the Cholas and Khairas left behind vast numbers of rulers and monuments. In the territory of the Dravidians, immense temples, fortresses, bridges, and reservoirs remain as witnesses of their skill. Their ethnic type is distinctly Ethiopian, short in stature, dark in complexion, with abundant curly hair, elongated skulls, and broad noses. Their features are mirrored in the sculptures of Babylon and Nineveh, and in the legends of Media and Persia. Dravidian languages are still spoken by tens of millions, and related speech forms survive in regions such as Baluchistan. Kushite custom traced descent through the mother, and in early India, succession was reckoned through the female line. Nephews born of sisters were heirs rather than sons. a practice reflecting the high position of women among Kushite peoples. Ancient accounts describe Indian queens of wisdom and authority, adorned with heavy gold ornaments and gems, ruling with dignity. Travelers from Marco Polo to Vasco da Gama spoke of the dark complexion of the Indian people and their wealth of temples, priests, and treasures. In all these traits, religion, law, art, and social structure, we recognize the enduring imprint of the Kushite race in India. Their presence shaped the earliest civilization of the subcontinent and left a legacy that continued through later ages, even as waves of conquest and change swept across the land. India has long been regarded as a land of mystery, its beginnings and the origins of its culture wrapped in debate and contradiction. Some claim her monuments and rock-hewn temples are of late construction, belonging only to the Christian era, yet deeper study suggests a far older foundation. Rawlinson observed that linguistic evidence points to a Kushite race that once stretched from Abyssinia across Arabia into India, leaving traces in inscriptions along the coasts of Baluchistan and Kerman. Early Sanskrit writings also describe the vast reach of this ancient Kushite empire, even linking its migrations with peoples from the Upper Nile who settled in India. In Hindu cosmology, the Puranas divided the world into 7 great regions, naming Africa as Sanchadvipa and India, together with the Mediterranean, as Kushadvipa. These records suggest an ancient unity of civilization stretching across continents. When Alexander the Great entered India, he did not find a land ruled solely by despotic kings, but rather republics and city-states. Nysa, for example, had a senate of 300 members. These republics were fortified, organized, and capable of fierce resistance. Alexander's armies, accustomed to sweeping victories, suffered heavy losses against the organized defenses of these Indian communities. Vast encampments were guarded by lines of wagons, their cities encircled by walls, and their fleets included boats and vessels. Some temples even depicted ships filled with foreign visitors, evidence of maritime contact. Farther east, in regions closer to the Ganges, powerful confederacies opposed him so strongly that his Macedonian troops, exhausted and fearful of the immense armies awaiting them, chose to retreat. Such accounts sharply contrast with modern portrayals that underestimate the power and organization of India's ancient peoples. The communal system of India, preserved most clearly in Buddhist times, provides a remarkable picture of collective life. Villages were tightly built clusters of homes, surrounded by sacred groves, grazing fields, and wide stretches of cultivated land. The fields were shared and cultivated simultaneously under the supervision of headmen. Irrigation channels were dug collectively, and water distribution was regulated by communal rules. Land was not privately mortgaged without the consent of the village council, and inheritance followed traditional communal rights. Women inherited from their mothers and were supported by the produce of their families' fields. Public buildings, reservoirs, and rest houses were constructed by joint effort, with no landlords and no paupers. Crime was rare, doors stood open, and life was ordered on principles of cooperation rather than competition. This stands in stark contrast to the individualism of Western peoples or the nomadic habits of Turanian and Semitic tribes. It was from such Kushite communal systems that the grand temples, palaces, and engineering works of India, Babylon, and Egypt arose. Metcalfe described these Indian villages as miniature republics, almost entirely self-sufficient, surviving unchanged through the rise and fall of dynasties, empires, and conquerors. Megasthenes, ambassador to the court of an Indian king around 300 BC, praised the honesty, sobriety, and courage of the people. He noted the absence of slavery, the chastity of women, and the industriousness of artisans and farmers. No locks were needed on doors, no Indian was known to lie, and lawsuits were rare. Agriculture was highly developed, and husbandmen were even exempted from war so that fields remained cultivated. Such descriptions call them worthy descendants of the blameless Ethiopians praised in ancient traditions. The very names of cities and peoples, Nisa, Nanda, Mali, retain African echoes still heard in the Sudan. Within the home, the communal principle extended further. Married sons brought their wives to live under the father's roof, all property and income pooled into a common treasury. Obedience to paternal authority was unquestioned, and even the weak and infirm shared equally in the resources of the household. Poverty was unknown in such a system, and the reverence for parental authority stood as one of India's deepest traditions. Women held a strong influence in religion, child-rearing, and family life. Their devotion was such that some chose to accompany their husbands in death as the ultimate expression of fidelity. Ornamentation and dress displayed both beauty and wealth, with India sustaining hundreds of thousands of goldsmiths whose work adorned women in garments and jewelry that dazzled with color and brilliance. The monumental architecture of India further testifies to the antiquity and originality of its civilization. The Brahmins did not come to power until centuries later, overthrowing Buddhism around 700 AD. Yet even they acknowledged that the ancient ruins had been built thousands of years earlier. The rock-hewn temples of Ellora, the carvings of Elephanta, and the grottos of Salsette were all created in an age before foreign conquest, displaying both the mythology and artistry of India at its peak. Inscriptions in undeciphered scripts hint at deep antiquity. The craftsmanship, identical in strength and precision to that seen in Egypt, suggests the same race of builders, the Kushite peoples whose genius for monumental art spanned continents. Thus, India's civilization, rooted in Kushite foundations, stands not as a late development, but as one of the earliest and most enduring expressions of human culture, a legacy of communal life, artistic mastery, and spiritual depth that shaped her history long before later invaders set foot on her soil. The myths carved into India's oldest sanctuaries are unmistakably Southern in spirit and setting. They reflect no Aryan or Turanian way of life. As early observers noted, the reliefs show troops mounted on elephants rather than horses, evidence against the idea that these monuments arose only in the last millennium. Their design marries simplicity and grandeur. Vast stone roofs borne on seemingly slender supports, great halls cut from living rock and carried on massive piers covered in sculpture and friezes, with painted reliefs and colossal beasts animating the interiors. The inscriptions are in Sanskrit, which would imply that Sanskrit belonged to the earliest builders. If such works had been erected as late as the early medieval period, only African master craftsmen could have produced granite carving of that caliber, because by then, much of the ancient skill had been lost. The once cultivated plains around many temples have reverted to jungle, and the topes reveal that the builders knew both pointed and circular arches, forms beyond the repertoire of Egypt and Greece. One royal site, Mavalipuram, was hewn directly from rock. Part of it has been swallowed by the sea. Its Cyclopean stonework ties it to the same tradition visible in Phoenicia, Arabia, Nubia, and Egypt, monuments so old that memory of their makers has faded. The pagodas rise like stepped pyramids, their mass and method akin to the oldest monumental styles. Centuries ago, travelers already found places like Elephanta deserted and mysterious. Their images, such as the towering and androgynous figure of Saiva, testifying to rites that had taken root long before written record, and to the later importation of northern cults, including practices like polyandry from the Tartarian borderlands. The earliest Kushite worship in India was comparatively pure. The later spread of Siva devotion, widow burning, human sacrifice, and other excesses belongs to the period when Brahmanism absorbed and reworked older beliefs. Notably, these ancient rock sanctuaries do not honor Brahma or Vishnu, underscoring that Turanian groups were not their architects. Their age aligns with the great stoneworks of the Nile. From the 2nd century before our era into the early medieval centuries, waves of Scythian and Hunnic peoples pressed into the subcontinent, and for generations native dynasties fought them. Around the 8th century, the Brahmin order rose, reinterpreting older ideas with elaborate philosophies and miraculous tales, and incorporating Siva worship while promoting cremation and other rites that reshaped social custom. Muhammad's followers appeared later, advancing slowly against staunch resistance. Some Rajput strongholds chose death over surrender. Elsewhere, southern Tamil powers, Chera, Chola, Pandya, kept the field for centuries. At no point did Islam command the whole peninsula. Hindu states remained, and in the Deccan, the struggle ran on for 200 years and more. In time, Arab and Indian lineages mingled, and out of that meeting came an architectural flowering without equal. The Taj Mahal's soaring conception and jeweler's finish continue to astonish, and the tomb of Akbar stands scarcely less impressive. The Mughal rulers displayed treasures amassed from conquered cities, wealth that later conquerors carried off to Persia and beyond. Yet their arrival altered less of the daily fabric of village life than their monumental buildings suggest. Social withdrawal of women increased under the pressure of foreign soldiery, but older patterns endured beneath courtly splendor. Modern accounts often magnify caste into an unyielding lattice of thousands of fixed ranks, yet in practice occupations shift, families rise, and guild-like bodies regulate craft standards, insurance, prices, and training. That framework helped perfect India's famous textiles, metalwork, gem setting, and inlay. Parallels appear on Africa's west coast, where clan taboos and dining rules echo Indian distinctions in food and fellowship. The barrier is not color. Caste excludes foreign newcomers of every kind, and even wealthy outsiders can find themselves beyond the pale. Many rules now linked with orthodoxy, early marriage, the ban on widow remarriage, the pyre, belong to later layers, not the oldest order. The contemporary Hindu outlook remains inward and contemplative. The present is seen as an age of decline, and many look past the rush of modern science for a quieter kind of wisdom. Daily life is shot through with ritual and reverence, as in the ancient Nile countries. Long before Northern Europe left its rough shelters, Indian thinkers were shaping metaphysics whose subtleties still command respect. The result is a civilization that measures success less by conquest or novelty than by depth of spirit, continuity of community, and the refinement of thought. India has given the world two of its greatest faiths, Buddhism and Brahmanism, each shaped by the diverse peoples and traditions of the land. Buddhism arose from an older civilization, long before the cult of Brahma, and many of India's most ancient shrines were first dedicated to Buddha. In the Ramayana, the two traditions appear as rivals. The idea of Buddha himself preceded Gautama, for ancient records speak of earlier incarnations, some celebrated by the Jains, others remembered in India, China, Tibet, and Nepal. This shows that Buddhism was not the creation of a single figure, but rather the product of centuries of religious growth, evolving out of older Kushite beliefs. Pilgrimages had once connected Western Europe and India, and in the mythology of the North, Woden, father of the gods, was seen as the counterpart of the Indian Buddha. Gautama, the prince of the Sakya clan, renounced wealth, family, and royal privilege in the 5th century before Christ to live as a seeker of truth. Moved by compassion, he embraced renunciation and taught that desire and indulgence were the roots of suffering. His life became the model of purity, patience, courage, charity, and self-restraint. He warned against harsh words, falsehood, drunkenness, theft, and excess. His teaching carried deliverance not through worship of deities, but through conduct and discipline. Though he left no writings, his words were carefully preserved and written down after his death. They bear striking resemblance to the teachings of Christ, though separated by 5 centuries. Unlike Brahmanism, Buddhism rejected caste, speaking directly to common people and offering a spiritual equality that appealed across races. Buddha's faith was carried far beyond India. Adopted by Scythians and Bactrians, it spread into China by the 1st century, into Tibet, Mongolia, Ceylon, Burma, and Japan. Asoka, the great non-Aryan emperor and grandson of Chandragupta, gave his powerful support to the faith in the 3rd century before Christ, founding monasteries and sponsoring tens of thousands of priests. Under his patronage, Buddhism became organized much as Christianity did later under Constantine. Though driven from India after centuries of struggle with Brahmanism, it triumphed abroad, shaping the faith and literature of 1/3 of humanity. From the Caspian to the Pacific, its shrines and monasteries arose, many built in the elegant pagoda style, with gilded domes and bell-shaped towers covered in jewels, surrounding statues of the sage whose memory millions still revere. Buddhist institutions included hospitals, monasteries, and great centers of learning like Nalanda, where thousands of monks lived in vast buildings, gardens, and lecture halls, studying religion, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. The atmosphere of kindness, honesty, and simplicity that Buddhism encouraged left a deep imprint on India even after its decline. Brahmanism, meanwhile, claimed the Vedas as its foundation, though these books predated Brahmin dominance. Only after centuries of struggle did Brahmins take control, reshaping the old scriptures to bolster their authority. Their doctrine exalted Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Siva the destroyer, though in practice Brahma receded into the background, and the worship of Siva and Vishnu became dominant. Where Buddhism forbade images, Brahmanism multiplied them. The Brahmins absorbed local deities wherever they went, reshaping myths and inserting themselves into ancient legends. In time, the harsher aspects of their rule showed through. Punishments of cruelty, the burning of widows, the rigid enforcement of caste, and rites that reflected influences from Mongolian and Tartar peoples who had pressed into India in later centuries. Yet, despite this dominance, Brahmanism carried within it the memory of the older Buddhist and Kushite traditions it had displaced. It claimed Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu, while reshaping epic poems with hostile caricatures of the Buddhists it had opposed. To this day, the religious life of India bears the mark of both streams: the pure ethical vision of Buddhism and the ritual complexity of Brahmanism. Where one spoke of equality and restraint, the other built hierarchy and power. Out of their long rivalry, India shaped a religious legacy that has influenced nearly every corner of the world. Barnett remarks that the early Aryas, or Brahmins, were a contentious people. When they entered India, they brought no women of their own, but took Dravidian wives. Settling in the Midlands, this mingling of Aryan and Kushite blood gave rise to the culture preserved in the Vedas. Sanskrit became the language of this literature because it was the tongue of the dominant element. Yet the knowledge found in the Vedas is uneven. Astronomy is only rudimentary, medicine is vague and entangled with sorcery, while history and geography are shaped more by imagination than by fact. Their society was patriarchal, unlike the matriarchal order of the Kushites. Tales of cruelty abound in the texts: blood feuds, executions, trampling by elephants, impalement, and other punishments that recall Assyrian or Hunnish atrocities rather than the noble ideals often attributed to Indo-Europeans. The Rig Veda, composed before 1000 BC, depicts a society resembling that of Homer's Iliad. Strangers strong in arms and culture from the late Bronze and early Iron Ages, subjugating and blending with a darker native race. Beyond the Rig Veda stand the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which far surpass anything else in Sanskrit. The Ramayana, with its 24,000 verses divided into 7 books, presents a vision of a city founded by Manu, the first sovereign of mankind, filled with temples, chariots, elephants, and prosperity, and free from deceit and evil. It is an allegory of good overcoming evil and reflects the ideals of Hindu life before 1000 BC, as well as Kushite civilization at its height. The Mahabharata, the longest epic poem ever written with 240,000 lines, is 8 times longer than both the Iliad and the Odyssey together. The Code of Manu, dating from around 1000 BC, regulated moral and social life. Buddhist scriptures, by contrast, contain 5 times the material of the Old and New Testaments combined. The Rig Veda itself is largely a collection of hymns, prayers, and commands, reflecting the imagination and seriousness of its authors, though later interpolations by Brahmins introduced coarser elements. The Puranas, often called the 5th Veda, are compilations of legends and lore, expanded by Brahmins into encyclopedic works, but based on older, smaller texts. The Jains, particularly in the south, accused the Brahmins of destroying true historical records and replacing them with altered myths, claiming that many divine heroes were in fact kings of Oud. As Buddhism waned, Jainism spread, and southern Dravidian communities carried on its legacy. Herein observed that the mythology of the Indian Bacchus, son of Kush, was transformed by Brahmins into Brahma. Likewise, Siva, now a major deity, does not appear in the earliest Vedas, but seems to be a later invention. Buddha himself denied the Brahmin claim to divinely appointed authority. The literature of India is immense. One king's library was so vast that it required 100 Brahmins to move it. Sanskrit, though no longer a living language after 200 BC, left behind an enormous body of verse, philosophy, and law. Its symmetry and richness make it one of the most refined tongues ever created, though its decline was hastened by Brahmin dominance. Much of this literature is written in meter, and Indian jurisprudence demonstrates a high degree of moral and intellectual development. Its laws resemble those of both the Germans and Hebrews, who were in contact with ancient Kushite traditions. Poetry consistently reveals a deep respect for women and an emphasis on tenderness and purity in their roles. The epics of India resemble Homer in their heroic scope, but they surpass them in magnitude and philosophical depth. They celebrate noble character, honor, and female influence, reflecting the Buddhist spirit that once permeated the land. The philosophical traditions are vast. Some schools focus on nature, others on the self, others on divine revelation. The Vedanta traces back to the author of the Mahabharata and emphasizes spiritual unity. The Sankhya system exalts nature and approaches atheism. The Yoga system stresses union with God through discipline and solitude. The Nyaya, associated with Buddha, is a logical and dialectical system that views the world as illusion and ultimate absorption into divinity as the goal. Sanskrit grammar shows remarkable precision, and its structure is closely related to Greek and Latin, though richer and more varied. The sacred writings of Buddhism were preserved in Pali, the older native tongue of India. By contrast, Persian bears little connection to Sanskrit, despite later theories of Aryan migrations. The influence of India's literary heritage on the world cannot be overstated. Fairy tales and romances from India spread across nations, delighting generations of children and storytellers. Many beloved tales, such as Cinderella, have their roots in Hindu tradition. Grammar, mathematics, and astronomy also reached impressive levels of sophistication. The earliest extant grammar dates to 300 BC, while Indian contributions to astronomy and mathematics shaped scientific traditions far beyond their borders. India's literary, philosophical, and scientific treasures reveal a civilization that profoundly enriched the world, laying foundations upon which much of later thought and culture has been built. In Greek mythology, one can trace traditions about the Medes, while Hindu records point to the Persians, though this does not necessarily mean they were of the same race. The Persians, celebrated under Cyrus, were once called Elamites. Ancient Indian law, in the Code of Manu, stated that Persians were originally a branch of their own race. Iranian traditions describe the lands of Persia and India as once inhabited by black-skinned people with short, woolly hair, closely related to the Kosai, mentioned by Strabo. From this connection, all Elam was called Scythia. Southern Susiana, known in cuneiform records as Anzan, was the land from which Cyrus's father ruled. The old Zend writings explain that the Medes, Persians, and Bactrians once shared a common language and religion. The Zend and Cyrus himself belonged to this early division. Later generations of Persians, however, were largely ignorant of their own past, especially after the invasions of northern Scythians, which erased many earlier memories just as similar disruptions had done in Greece. Greek tradition claimed that the Medes descended from Medus, son of Jason and Media, while Arminus, his brother, was the ancestor of the Armenians. In Lydia, stories told that Babylon and Nineveh had been founded by Lydian princes, and that colonies from these centers spread across distant lands, even to Western Europe. They traced the origins of the Etruscans and early European states to this same root. In Media and Armenia, many memorials of Jason and Media were said to exist, and the Magi, famous for their enchantments, were believed to descend from Media, the sorceress, daughter of the king of Colchis. Their practices of charms and omens spread far, influencing India, Egypt, and the wider world. Legends spoke of their first homeland as a land of perpetual spring, peace, and light, a memory of an early golden epoch when nature was mild before the onset of harsh winters that drove them to migrate. The region of Media corresponds roughly to the northern parts of Persia. While its exact ancient boundaries are debated, it lay southeast of Colchis and Armenia, in the path of the Akkadian race that once peopled Assyria and Elam. Unlike Mesopotamia or India, Media lacked abundant rivers and rainfall, and this slowed its development. Still, the capital, Ecbatana, situated amidst verdant mountains and streams, became famous as the summer residence of the Persian kings. Ancient writers describe it as vast, with immense walls, though the people trusted more in their courage than in fortifications. The land was rich in fruits such as apples, pears, peaches, apricots, olives, and vines. Cereals and vegetables grew abundantly alongside cotton and tobacco fields. Media also had mineral wealth, including prized marbles, and supported lions, tigers, bears, camels, and the celebrated Nisaean horses. The religious tradition of the Medes and Persians survives in the Zend Avesta, written in a language older than Median. This collection, originally 21 books, reflects the spirit of the ancient Kushite Bactrians, ancestors of both Persia and Media. The texts exalt unseen powers of nature, expressing awe and reverence. The storm god, fire, and intoxicating drink are personified in Indra, Agni, and Soma. These writings portray the eternal struggle between good and evil, though over time, northern influences introduced new rites, such as the worship of Seva, which blended into the broader pantheon. Unlike the old Kushite faith, the newcomers denied bodily resurrection, teaching instead that burial or cremation would pollute earth and air. Accounts differ as to the origin of the Avesta. Ancient authors claimed that Zoroaster, remembered as its founder, composed it in the earliest ages. He is described in contradictory ways, as a Persian, a Bactrian king, or an Aryan. Some dated him thousands of years before the Trojan War. While later legends turned him into a supernatural figure, the earliest hymns depict him simply as a man of faith, struggling with doubt, opposition, and disbelief, yet trusting in his God. The Avesta was once said to be vast, written on thousands of hides in golden script and preserved in Persepolis until Alexander's conquest led to its burning. Later priests salvaged fragments, and further losses came with the spread of Islam. The Avesta also reveals striking linguistic and religious contrasts. In its pages, evil spirits are called Daiva, while in India and other lands, the same word meant divine beings of light. Conversely, in India, Asura denoted demons, while in Iran, Ahura meant God. These reversals point to conflicts between opposing sects and perhaps between old and incoming peoples. Zoroaster himself was said to have been murdered at the altar by Turanians, showing how his reforms were resisted. Later, Magi claimed his legacy but altered his teachings, just as Brahmins had done in India. Darius the Great sought to restore purity to this tradition, showing that even in antiquity, the Avesta had already undergone significant changes. In this faith, the supreme figure does not resemble any Japhethic ideal. Rather, he appears as an Eastern monarch attended by wise men. Existence is cast as a struggle between two camps, forces of light and forces of darkness, contesting the human soul. Few traditions make it plainer that every act tips the balance. Good deeds fortify the cause of righteousness, while wrongdoing aids the adversary. Sin is not erased, only outweighed by virtuous action. Zoroaster speaks of revelations, dreams, and direct communion with the divine. He is unwavering about the eventual victory of good, the vindication of the upright, and a time when the faithful will prevail, the just receive their reward, and the tempter be cast into a powerless abyss. He envisions a single, undivided reign of God, both in heaven and on earth. Later editions brought in other divine beings and ritual prohibitions, and a prophecy arose that 3 millennia after Zoroaster, a descendant would appear, the dead would rise, and a renewed, incorruptible world would begin, an early echo of the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. As for the Magi, whether they were a branch of the ancient people remembered in Greek legend as kin to Media, or a ruling caste introduced with Scythian movements from the north, their innovations depart markedly from older Persian customs, suggesting an intrusive element. These priests trafficked in enchantments and augury, practices favored by the northern steppe tribes. Exposure of corpses, so that birds and beasts might consume them, was among their novelties. In earlier Persia, even in Herodotus's time, burial was the rule. Median history emerges around 950 BCE, when Assyria ravaged sections of the land, deporting entire communities and replacing them with foreign settlers. Cyaxares, seeking to avenge his father, first led an untrained levy against a waning Assyria and suffered defeat. After drilling his troops, he pressed the Assyrians back into their fortifications, only to learn that Scythians were flooding into Media. For 26 years, he grappled with these fierce newcomers. In alliance with Babylonia, he besieged Nineveh repeatedly until it fell. The victors divided the spoils of empire with little friction. Media took the northern zones, Babylon the southern. Cyaxares then made war on Lydia, a contest halted in its 6th year by a solar eclipse that frightened both sides into a truce. After Nineveh's collapse, Asia's great powers were Babylonia, Media, and Lydia, whose royal houses intermarried as kindred lines. Arianis, sister of Chrysus, wed Astyages of Media. Amaitis, Astyages' sister, married Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Greek tradition traced Lydia's ruling line back to Ninus and Belus, and we must remember that Assyria, save for 6 or 7 centuries, had been subject to Babylon. When Cyaxares died, Media passed to Astyages, and in 556 BCE to his grandson Cyrus of Persia. Herodotus calls Cyrus the son of Cambyses, a Persian noble and a daughter of Astyages. Because of a prophetic dream, the infant was handed to a herdsman to be killed. Xenophon likewise makes him Astyages' grandson. Other accounts say he spent his first years under the stern discipline of Persia, and then was sent to the Median court amid luxury. Ctesias calls him an Amardian, linking him to the older stock. When he entered Babylon, its clergy received him as a native ruler. He honored the old gods, returning them to their shrines with ceremony, the same deities venerated by the Sumerian people from whom he sprang. He was among the last rulers of that ancient line to try to re-knit the wide-reaching order of earlier ages, even giving his son the title King of the World. After his death, peoples allied to that heritage cast off Persian control. Cyrus's name, in its native form, is Kurush, recalling Kush. Darius's principal seat was Susa, once the capital of Old Elam. The tomb at Murghab, bearing "I am Cyrus the Achaemenian," cannot be that of Cyrus the Great. Its date belongs after Darius, and the carved figure is of Kushite type. As a youth, Cyrus is said to have passed from the austere manners of Persia to the indulgence of the Median court, which he scorned as a betrayal of the old ways. Persia would have none of the Magi's gross, unspiritual rites. When Assyrians threatened his grandfather's realm, he accompanied the campaign, later begging leave to return home. Refused, he fled during a feast. Astyages pursued and invaded Persia. Cambyses fell in the clash. The Persians were driven back, and Cyrus, rallying his forces, still had to yield until the cries of their women on the high ground shamed the men into a ferocious counterattack. The tide turned, and a night assault near the Persian capital brought a decisive victory. Astyages was captured, and the Medes welcomed Cyrus as a liberator from the encroaching Turanian Scyths. The Zoroastrian order was restored. Magian practices, for a time, were thrust aside. Cyrus subdued Cappadocia, defeated Croesus, took Sardis, then marched back across the Euphrates against Assyria. Jewish sources speak of prophecies that had named him in advance. In the generations after him, Darius and his nobles sought to curb the barbarous northern strain that had seeped into Media. Darius belonged to the old stock, as his acts show. Under the harshness of mixed Median rule, ancient houses from both Media and Persia had been exiled. Darius overthrew the usurpers, recalled the banished, and reissued the Avesta, the sacred books of the Bactrian forebears, which had been contaminated by Turanian magic. The language of these texts differed from contemporary Median speech and reflects the older idiom of Susiana, Elam, and Bactria. Darius's aim was to restore the ancestral faith. Scholars have argued that magism did not prevail until about the 6th century BCE, while Zoroastrianism was already 1,000 years old. True Persians and Medes resisted Magian customs. The disdain for burial, the absence of blood sacrifice, the lack of images and temples. In time, however, the new forms spread and triumphed. Ancient witnesses say Zoroaster's doctrines met fierce resistance among mixed Aryan communities, leading to religious wars. One scholar calls his chief opponents the Indo-Aryan priesthood, the Brahmins, whose own scriptures curse Zoroaster, which makes it strange to credit them with creating his creed. By Strabo's era, Magi had become a blanket term for Persian priests. Darius's great inscription at Behistun states flatly that the Magian usurpation destroyed the temples and sacred hymns of the original Zoroastrian worship, and that he restored the ancient book throughout the lands, and the people followed. In those same texts, he aligns himself with the earlier race. With the restoration came traditional burial and the reappearance of Indra, Mithra, and Krishna, old names of the Kushite pantheon and ancient kings, while Deva, once gods, had been rebranded as demons. Persian art mirrors Susiana and Babylon because they share the same root. Palaces rose on high terraces, columns marched with sculpted beasts, and the walls bore the imagery of the older mythology. The finest remains of this style lie at Persepolis, later burned by Alexander. Buildings stand on separated platforms. The great audience halls, such as the 100-column hall, belonged to an idiom unlike any later Persian work. The columns match no Greek or Egyptian order. Iron clamps once bound the precisely fitted stones. Winged, human-headed creatures and composite guardians with leonine bodies and equine legs keep watch, motifs of the remote age. The reliefs show embassies from many lands bringing tribute: furs, fine garments, tools, fruits, spices, and animals, evidence of commerce across a far-flung network of colonies. The inscriptions are in archaic scripts, marking real antiquity. Bactrians had preceded Medes at Ecbatana, and similar forms appear there and at Persepolis, pointing to a common source. Politically, Persian rulers held civilization together by thrusting back Scythian waves and creating a more centralized form of the older dual authority. Provincial power split between satrap and general, both overseen by royal agents, the king's ear and the king's eye, who reported and enforced loyalty. Effective as it was, this system could not hide the collapse of the older commercial order once thriving from the Indus to the Euphrates. Assyria's brutality and Persia's rapid conquests shattered the royal cities that anchored Asian trade. The Scythians ceased to be trusted carriers, and the economic fabric frayed. Compared with the long dominion of the ancient empire, Persia's supremacy was brief, about 2 centuries. Much of Persian literature has vanished, though scattered references suggest it was once abundant. The later people were not traders, and the language in which the Avesta survives, Pahlavi, blends Old Persian with Semitic elements, speech of a conqueror grafted on the tongue of the older race. The oldest layer is archaic and metrical. Some sections date to the Sasanian age, but the earliest parts must reach back to Zoroaster. Hymns celebrate Iranian gods and heroes from the East, while another treatise, poetic in form, praises agriculture. The language cannot be Semitic, nor is it simply Sanskrit. Contradictions abound in the historical record, and chronicles were often reshaped, just as the religion was edited. When Median and Persian hosts faced Lydia, they appeared as barbarians because the inherited civilization was in flux. When the ancient strain resurfaced in power, its genius reasserted itself, halting Scythian advance and guarding the world's culture. In later centuries, Persia became a beacon of learning under Islam. Baghdad shone as a center of letters and poetry. The wonders celebrated in tales of the East were followed by decline. Court ceremonial made the monarch an object of adoration. Eunuchs guarded the harem. The royal bed stood on golden feet. Among the mixed peoples, drunkenness was common, as were harsh penalties, a contrast with the sobriety and truthfulness attributed to older Indian kindred. Caste-like divisions hardened, reflecting resentment toward the darker, more cultivated population. Polygamy spread, education faltered, yet the Queen Mother often wielded decisive influence, as in earlier times. Greek lore cast the struggles of Cyrus and Alexander as the old race moving back and forth across its ancient sphere. The Persian expedition, a reply to Europe's assault at Troy. Remarkable artistry still flowered as late as the 7th century. Carvings of astonishing finesse, a riot of vines and foliage with birds and beasts, unmatched for delicacy. When the armies of Islam seized the Persian capital, they found among the spoils a vast brocade carpet, hundreds of feet long, jeweled to imitate a walled garden, emerald leaves, blossoms of rubies, sapphires, and pearls. Centuries of pillage and decay have erased most traces of that splendor. Today, after long admixture with foreign peoples, the native stock has faded, yet merchants and farmers still produce superb textiles, tapestries and shawls that few can rival. A faithful remnant continues, despite pressure, to keep the old religion of Iran. The histories of India, Persia, Arabia, Chaldea, Egypt, and Ethiopia are extraordinary. Yet even more remarkable is the account of the Kushite peoples who once flourished in Western Europe. The celebrated mythology of Greece preserves vivid images of these Kushites, whose drama unfolded across the lands of Europe and around the Mediterranean long before the rise of Greek civilization. Their presence is stamped upon the landscape, confirmed by discoveries of modern science, which reveal that the shifting tides of tribes across Europe in early times were echoes of far older struggles between the Kushites and the westernmost sons of Japheth, the Turanians. This perspective helps unravel the long-debated mystery of the Celts and the roots of the so-called Aryan race. Many modern authorities admit that Aryans cannot trace their true beginnings. Yet by studying the earliest records and the remains scattered across Europe, it becomes clear that the legendary figures celebrated in Greek tradition, heroes such as Hercules, Bacchus, Apollo, and Hermes, were descendants of Kush, the ancient founder of the Kushite Empire of Ethiopians. What appear as myths are, in truth, distorted reflections of real people and events. Today, there is renewed interest in these old legends, for reason suggests that myth is but history clothed in poetic imagery. Scholars have long struggled with the meaning of the Greek stories, but mounting evidence shows they commemorate the deeds of Kushites and their kin, the descendants of Africa's earliest ruling families, the same stock as Zeus of the Greeks, Jupiter of the Romans, and Amen-Ra of Egypt. So enduring are these tales that they still dominate the study of classical literature in universities, where they remain the backbone of higher learning. The irony is striking. The most influential branches of the so-called Aryan race, as history proves, are themselves deeply connected to Kushite blood. Another volume devoted to this theme presents the full weight of evidence for the Kushite origins of Western Europe, woven together with the drama that inspired the Greek legends themselves.